Okay. We are live, Alexander, and we are waiting for Robert to join us soon. How are you doing in London, Alexander?
Well as one can, given the fact that the economic situation here just goes on getting worse. You know, you expect the news to be bad, and then it just turns out to be even more bad. So, sterling is crashing. We're now moving towards parity with the dollar. I mean, we're very close to that point. We've almost hit parity in the past, but this will be a big psychological stress. We have a prime minister who's, as I said, gone AWOL and is really more interested in Ukraine. We got a new prime minister coming next week, who nobody, I think, takes particularly seriously. I've been giving information in private to London about things I have seen. I've actually seen with my own eyes in London just over the last week or so. And you get the sense that things here are going really bad. It's like London is becoming like what I hear some people say San Francisco is like. It seems to me we're on identical trajectories.
Hmm.
And I see Robert has
Robert is
entered
with
the room.
us. Robert, how are you?
Good.
Awesome. Robert, where can people find you?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Guys, let's jump into it. Let's first say hello to everyone watching us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com. I will have all of Robert's information as to where you can find him in the description box down below, and then I will add it as a pinned comment as well. Hello to all of our moderators. Who is moderating today? Let's see. I know I am. I know Alan Watson is. And me and you, Alan. I think it is me and you, though I'm sure other people will be joining us soon, other moderators. Let's get into it because, Robert, Alexander, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So, Alexander, I leave it to you and to Robert, and let's get rolling.
Well, I mean, this is turning into an extraordinary autumn, if I may say so. So, I mean, there's lots going on the political front in Britain, in the United States too. Obviously, what goes on in the United States is, to be very clear, far more important and actually ultimately much more interesting. We have a situation in Ukraine which is getting crazier and crazier by the day. I mean, the news that's been coming out from Ukraine over the last 24 hours is just, I mean, it just does make you wonder who really is in charge, if anybody is. We've had a economic situation that is getting incredibly bad. We have a president in the United States who seems to me to be completely incapable of doing anything. And yet, Robert, they tell us that the Democrats are rising in the opinion polls, that the situation there is turning to their advantage, that they're going to keep the Senate, maybe even hold on to the House, that the Republican landslide is melting away, that Sarah Palin's defeat in Alaska is somehow a sign of things to come, that the opinion polls are shifting. I'm going to tell you straight away, I don't believe a word of it, but you're going to tell us a lot more about it, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting times. And obviously the Trump legal case continues to develop in new and interesting directions. I believe they may be in court today. Whether I think the district court that's assigned the case is actually a Trump appointee, is the judge. That she's already indicated that she is likely to grant a lot of the relief that Trump has requested. And the last-ditch effort of the Justice Department to salvage it, I don't think will be successful, at least in the court of law. It was temporarily successful in the court of public opinion, with the version number, however many now, of Trump is done, we got him, he's finished, being spread and circulated. The only difference being some people on the right took the bait on this because they don't understand the American federal criminal process. So for those out there, the official media story this week was that the Justice Department, through a grand jury, had issued a subpoena to Trump. This was the media version. And that Trump had produced a bunch of classified records, said that it was all the classified records that he had, and including records simply marked classified, whether they legally were or were not. and that they did the search warrant and found a bunch more records. So that meant Trump had been caught obstructing justice and committing perjury to the grand jury and so forth. The problem with that narrative is the way subpoenas work in the criminal grand jury process in the United States is that if a subpoena is issued to an entity, in other words, a business, an LLC, a charter, a foundation, or whatever, it's just to an organization, but a legally recognized entity, then certain rights don't exist in your ability to object. So, for example, your First Amendment rights to object based on selective prosecution are to some degree a personal right that you would only have as an individual that an organization wouldn't necessarily have. Sometimes they do, but often they don't in the criminal grand jury context. This is particularly, it's also true in the presidential privilege context. So Trump's assertion of presidential privilege could be a personal privilege to him in certain instances. Consequently, only he could raise them. He couldn't raise them on behalf of another organization. Last but not least at all is the Fifth Amendment right, what's called the active production privilege. Last time this was fully litigated was actually Webb Hubble during the Clinton era. So the issue was you issue me a subpoena. You don't ask for my testimony, but you ask me to produce things. Now, this goes to the U.S. Supreme Court's attempt over the years to water down the Fifth Amendment right, what is called the right against self-incrimination, but actually it's much broader than that. It's a right not to be a witness against yourself. In other words, and all that really has historically was supposed to have meant was you could not be called by the adversarial party to testify. But that didn't just limit itself to it being a witness as in any capacity, producing documents. In my view, it applies to body examinations, everything. The U.S. Supreme Court has limited that to simply testimonial. So that if the act is not testimonial, if it's not like you're on the witness stand physically testifying with your words, then it's no longer being a witness within the Fifth Amendment. The question is, what happens when they issue you a subpoena? Does that subpoena now make you a witness if they're not asking for you to testify? Because you can be subpoenaed for documents or testimony. And the Supreme Court recognized, well, in the context of you being subpoenaed for documents, you're being asked to testify because you're being asked to verify, authenticate those documents. All the reasons why the media was trying to spin that Trump was in trouble is exactly why you as an individual have a Fifth Amendment right not to produce or respond to a subpoena to you individually. D.C. grand jury knew this, or the FBI did. And so what the FBI did is they didn't subpoena Trump. They subpoenaed the office of Donald John Trump, a organizational entity Trump had set up after he left office to be a potential transitionary source for the archives, but it wasn't yet designated that in terms of presidential records, and then for other purposes. So they decided to subpoena the entity. By doing that, they stripped Trump of his ability to make personal objections, but they also stripped themselves of the right to claim Trump committed a crime for the most part, and however it was responded to. That subpoena then goes to the records custodian for that entity. That entity doesn't necessarily have to have all the documents. And so the person signed, certified that he as records custodian produced the documents that were in his custody at that time. So the fact when they did the search, they did a different search. They didn't search the office of Donald Trump. They searched the personal residence of Donald Trump.
Ooh.
And consequently, they got more documents than what they got the first time. That contradiction doesn't mean anything. And the best evidence of it is the fact that the Justice Department disclosed these facts. By the way, they first tell the judge they have to hide these facts from the affidavit. So they finally disclose a very redacted affidavit. So much so it's a popular meme now. You have Joe Biden walking up the redacted steps and falling down over and over again. I mean, that's how big a meme it is. And what they did is they took that and they said, we have to keep this information secret, Judge, just a week ago, actually. And then they turn around this week and disclose a bunch of stuff, which shows how much their redactions were always in bad faith. They were only doing it to what helps them and hurts them. And they're able to fight Trump in the court of public opinion by using their court filing in opposition to Trump's request for a special master to be assigned the case and for the records to be removed from the FBI's custody and given to a special master. And consequently, in that context, they said, oh, look, we got Trump dead to rights. He obstructed justice. He didn't disclose documents. He had somebody lie and perjure themselves on a certification to a federal grand jury. Hey, look, we're going to show you a photo. First time they've ever done a photo of supposedly classified records, right? They're disclosing that to the world in court proceedings. It shows you how much they actually value classifications, if they even sincerely believe that these things were classified. They can't be legally at this point because Trump declassified them. But putting that point aside, so the media story runs Trump's in trouble. A bunch of people on a fair number of people on the right panic and say, oh, wow, Trump really is in trouble, et cetera, playing off of America's colloquial and public ignorance of the federal criminal justice process. The Justice Department would never even publicly disclose that to a defense target if they actually planned on indicting him on those grounds. Because they would want to hold that in abeyance while they entrap witnesses to make admissions against their interest and build their case. Reality, as has come out today, I put out a recommended bet months ago that Trump would not be indicted by September 1st. He has not been indicted by September 1st. He's not likely to be indicted throughout the fall. There's always a risk because we got a crazy DC political system. We got a crazy DC grand jury. We got a politically contaminated process from top to bottom. So they could always go rogue and indict Trump anyway, but they don't have legal grounds to do so. He committed no crime. There's no evidence he committed a crime. People misunderstood how subpoenas work in America in the federal criminal process. The Justice Department was the one playing games, and they just got burned. What all of it does confirm to me, though, is what we talked about the very first time we discussed this case, which was, I think, right after the raid, which was my theory was that this was a deep state raid for deep state documents. And everything that has happened since then moves all in that direction. And the fact that what it's really weird at this stage is to object to a special master. Generally speaking, when you're not on the clock, when these are supposed to be government archive documents that you're concerned about, you would have no problem whatsoever with a special master. For those people out there that may not know what that is in the American justice process, if there's some dispute about the government having possession or custody of documents, a federal district court judge can appoint a lawyer as a quote-unquote special master to review the documents and see whether the government's entitled to them or not, usually in the context of privilege, most likely attorney-client privilege, sometimes other privileges that may apply. But Trump has moved for that, arguing both presidential privilege and attorney-client privilege. And said these documents should be removed from Justice Department custody, given to a special master. Special master should filter through and decide. The fact that the Justice Department is obsessed with fighting this to such a degree they're willing to run a false smear campaign against Trump in the pleadings is more evidence that they are obsessed that nobody else see these documents. I mean, not even a special master, not even a federal district court judge. They don't want anybody to see what they seized. Now, my hunch is that what they were looking for, they didn't get. Because what this is since Trump left under the guise of the archives, the deep state has been trying to get back any documents Trump took with him that could implicate the deep state operations in the United States. And the guy running the investigation had to resign, or one of the key agents running the investigation had to resign this past week rather than be subject to an independent inspector general inquiry because he was heavy involved in Russiagate, then had covered up for Hunter Biden, had instructed agents not to investigate the Hunter Biden laptop, now magically ends up leading the investigation against Trump. I mean, it's like you can't have a clear roadmap here. But just to avoid the inspector general being legally entitled to ask him questions, he resigned instead, removing the inspector general's jurisdiction over him and returning it to the Justice Department where all of his pals and buddies are, and where he knows he won't be investigated, much as Kleinsmith got a clean walk, the Russiagate lawyer who lied to the Pfizer court. So so long story short or short story long, Trump is not in as nearly as precarious position as some laid him out to be. Number one. Number two, for all the critics of Trump out there, the deep state sure does hate him, despise him, and fear him. So clearly he did something that triggered their fear. So for those people who think, he's really in on it or he's not really, there's a lot of criticism to be for Trump in terms of a lot of decisions he made. But clearly the deep state still considers him almost an existential threat to their position, prestige, and power moving forward. And in the process of that, they've exposed themselves to the world. And a lot of people who didn't understand J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was always the political police on the right now are seeing the current FBI as precisely that.
Yeah. Can I just make a few quick points? First of all, I can say from my own background, I was, as I said, for a long time, a lawyer working in the Royal Courts of Justice in London, that procedure, what people call procedure, is the essence of law. It is the most important part of the legal process, because if procedure is corrupted, which is what I think it was a word that actually Robert used, if it's corrupted, no outcome can possibly be fair. So if you have a deeply twisted procedural system, it's almost guaranteed to twist or malform the outcome in some kind of way. The second is something that flows entirely from my own personal experience, which is that when something sounds extremely complicated, especially extremely complicated procedurally, then it means that one party, the party that is driving the litigation, and this is a form of litigation, doesn't actually have a legal case. I mean, that is an iron law I can follow. Now, I have always found it always worked for me. So what we have seen here, if I've understood what Robert is saying correctly, is the Justice Department, its officials, playing around with different procedural devices. They seek a subpoena, for example, not against Donald Trump the man, but against Donald Trump the office. They then pivot in mid-flow in order to sort of broaden this, to start searching for other documents. They engage in selective briefings of what they're doing. They will publish what they say is a redacted affidavit, which will exclude all kinds of important information. And by the way, I should always say, remember that the FBI is, in a way that I've never completely understood, but it's part of the Justice Department apparatus, or so I understand. But anyway, so they give us a redacted affidavit one day, and then we have all kinds of information the next day, which could have been in that redacted affidavit, but which wasn't. So what we have is a situation where we're only being shown some of the cards. And remember, legal process is supposed to be conducted in an open way. Some of the cards, but they are the cards which the Justice Department wants us to see. Now, first of all, it stinks. This is completely wrong. This is not the way things are supposed to be done. Secondly, it is actually worse than what I thought in that last program that we did. You remember when we did that program, I said this is like a state within the state behaving in a particular way, targeting one individual who it saw as a threat, using all kinds of procedural devices to go after him, but doing so in fundamental disregard, even contempt of law. Well, what I have heard makes me even more concerned about that, because it shows a fundamental disrespect to procedure, to legal procedure by the Justice Department, which is, let us never forget, the essence of law. And next, and most important of all, this person whom all this is being done to is the former president of the United States of America. He is being set up and misused in this way, in a way that I find absolutely astonishing. This is how America treats its former presidents. Now, remember, Donald Trump is not indicted with anything. He isn't charged with anything. There's no allegations at the moment, which have been translated into any sort of effective legal process. And that is astonishing, actually. That is incredible. Not because he's actually done anything, but because he hasn't ever done anything. Now, I don't know whether, Robert, you've read this article by Conrad Black. There's been an article circulating. We've been reading it a lot in Britain, where Conrad Black is, by the way, a very well-known person. He used to own the Daily Telegraph once upon a time and was a good proprietor, by the way. Anyway, he's made this point that Donald Trump, ever since he announced that he was going to stand for the office of president of the United States, has been targeted for smear after smear, investigation after investigation. He's had the entire rule book thrown out as these people come after him, using every procedural and legal device. And of course, they've gone out of their way to make him out to be some kind of, well, Russian agent, criminal, inciter, rebel, person who's going to overthrow the Constitution, coup plotter, what you like. And this is being done by the senior agencies of the government of the United States. And what we are seeing with this affair, or so I strongly feel, is a continuation of this campaign against this individual, which to me looks in itself, frankly, somewhat, shall we say, eccentric or irrational, but put that aside. But of course, I come back to this. If this can be done to a person who's held the office of President of the United States, then who is safe from having it done to them?
The Trump case proves that Julian Assange was right at a broader level than just his individual case. Because what's fascinating to look at the legal theories, political assumptions of the deep state operatives throughout this entire case is here you have a certain custom and protocol dealing with presidential records. So there's a law that's called the Presidential Records Act, and it governs everyone except the president, as the courts themselves have previously made clear. And all it was a way for the archives to store, digitize, and most importantly, for Freedom of Information Act request purposes, have available documents in their custody and control that were created during the presidency. However, the president gets to unilaterally and in a non-reviewable form decide what is in fact a presidential record and a personal record. And to give not only that, the president can unilaterally throughout his entire presidency declare what is and is not classified. And that's because he's the only constitutionally elected officer. Everybody in the executive branch, everybody gets their power from the president by constitutional order. What's extraordinary is the deep state doesn't believe in that. They believe they should have the power, and the president's just another bureaucratic regulatory official, and that the president can't determine what is and isn't classified, that the president can't determine what is and is not a presidential record. Things that are just contrary to the plain language of the law, plain language of the Constitution, plain language to our history, also plain contrary to custom and practice. When people are like, how in the world could Trump have any documents that had the label? And this is the game they played. The grand jury subpoena, the search warrant affidavit, all of it didn't ask for classified records. It asked for records that were marked classified. But if anybody's ever gone through the FOIA archives at the FBI, the CIA, or anywhere else, then you get documents. I have documents right now in my possession that have the label classified or the label top secret or the label human source at the top. That's because they are documents from the 50s and 60s and 70s, including a nice little interesting detailed dossier on a certain Mr. Bandera that was written up for the various aspects of the U.S. government that describe exactly who and what he is and the movement that it was all about. You can find it. And, some of those documents have top secret, human source, classification labels on them. That doesn't make them classified. It's like saying that the label is what makes something classified. It's like a level of insanity. It's bureaucratic nuttiness. It's the movie Brazil. I mean, it's just like how. But it gives an idea where their mindset, their mentality is. They think they are above the law. They think they are the law. They think they're above the elected officials, number one. Number two, they think they determine what is and isn't secret. And the third factor is everything the way they've handled this case. is that Assange's fundamental premise was that it's like from the movie Sneakers, No More Secrets, is that the problem with corruption in government, how bad people get away with doing bad things on a massive scale, depends entirely on secrecy. His belief was that if you stripped secrecy from the state, you would strip it of its capacity to do large-scale evil on a continual basis. So that, I mean, it wasn't just about, hey, exposing individual crimes of individual countries, of individual places and times. It was part of a broader thesis that if we're going to defeat the corruption of states, we must expose their secrets. We must strip them of their secrets. No more secrets. And you see how obsessed in the currency of secrets the deep state is. They are obsessed that Trump had some of their secrets. They went to every shenanigan in the book, disguising it as an archives request, disguising it as a grand jury subpoena, disguising it as a search warrant, disguising it as demands that Trump had supposedly committed a crime that he couldn't have committed. All of those things just to get these documents back because they're obsessed with secrecy. Secrecy is built into their DNA. It is essential to their defense. And you see it with just how they handled the redactions and unredactions. They redact certain parts, then they selectively unredact them. Just a week later, magically, they became not needed to be redacted. Secrecy kills. Secrecy corrupts. Assange's fundamental premise is right, and there's no better evidence of it than the entire Trump case.
Absolutely. If you're dealing with deeply manipulative people and manipulative people, by the way, are the most dangerous, that is exactly what they do. They hold back what they want and they publish what they want. And that's how they try to distort understanding and how they try to manipulate you. I mean, I've seen this happen so many times, actually, in my professional life. And it's quite amazing to see the Justice Department of the United States behaving in exactly that way. I'm one of these people who finds the word manipulative. It's when I use it, it is a very, very strong and very condemnatory word coming from me. And this is a deeply manipulative process. A few things to say. Firstly, you're absolutely right about Julian Assange. I mean, I know people, as I said, who are close to Julian Assange. That is, you've described what he thinks exactly. He thinks that in democracies, especially, government should be an honest and open and transparent, and that if things are made secret, and far too many things happen in secret nowadays, then that's how all kinds of bad things happen. Because where there is secrecy, there is a lack of responsibility, there is a lack of accountability, because how can the people hold their representatives, their governments accountable if they don't know what they do? And that is, I mean, that's so obvious and so fundamental. And of course, it goes right to the heart of the current crisis. And it is a crisis. And Robert, you were talking about how the deep state, the officials in the deep state cannot understand that Donald Trump isn't just an official like themselves, that he's in fact the elected president of the country, and in fact the elected head of the executive. And in fact, the executive, in effect, is essentially the organization that is the system that is created to assist him in his work as the representative of the people who are sovereign. I mean, that's a point always to understand about this. Well, that inevitably brought me back to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman in the first impeachment. And I will never forget this. This is, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. He's in this National Security Council. He's obviously somebody who is part of the permanent bureaucracy of the United States. And you see him spluttering with anger before a congressional committee because Donald Trump is doing something which, in Vindman's view, contradicts the policy of something called the interagency. I mean, that is exactly the mindset that these people have. It's exactly as you said it, Robert. They don't respect the office of president. They see the president of the United States very much in the way that the British Constitution sees the British Queen. The British Queen, remember, is not elected. She is there not to lead the executive or represent the people. She is there to simply sign off whatever the executive tells her to do. So though ministers are supposed to be the Queen's ministers, in fact and in practice, as we all know, she's actually their queen.
Yeah, I mean it's extraordinary. So we'll see how it all sort of folds out, but it's the beliefs about how the deep state really operates have been proven true over and over and over again throughout the Trump administration, and it's just woken up a lot of normies. To use the gamer terminology, it's woken up a lot of people who thought the FBI was this, the 1950s propaganda version of the FBI that Hoover helped institute in American public consciousness. That it's dragnet, it's just the facts, ma'am. It's that's why they got the haircut and the suits and all the rest. Not recognizing it was a foundationally corrupt agency. It was created by one of the most corrupt people in American legal history, J. Edgar Hoover. There's plenty of information about a lot of things about Hoover that some people on the right are still in denial about, which is extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, so now maybe he'd be a woke hero today. I don't know, who knows? I mean, that maybe J. Edgar Hoover's the perfect deep state guy today because if he embraced his wokeness, his inner wokeness, then it could all work. But it was always it was, since the days of Arnold Palmer, when he was blaming anarchists for things that were, some of those things at least were likely not anarchists that did. There was never proven that it did. Not only the Wall Street bombing, but the Palmer. There was a convenient organization suddenly appeared in the name of anarchism, committing violence targeted at political officials, often failing to be successful in ways that elevated dramatically the power of J. Edgar Hoover from a small investigator inside the Justice Department to his own agency at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And then those people were managed to never be caught. Just, you can put your own math together about what that might have actually been. But that's who Hoover was going all the way back, and targeted political dissidents from day one. The difference is it's now partisan as to Trump. And so the Clinton and Obama and the Bushes were all protected by the deep state. But now, because Trump defines republicanism to a large degree, it has become overtly partisan in ways it wasn't under Hoover. Hoover just targeted whoever the dissident was, didn't care where you came from party-wise. And there weren't quite the same partisan gaps. Indeed, the Kennedy brothers were the biggest threat to the deep state that ever got close to power. And so we're seeing a roadmap and they'll continue to harass and harangue Trump. But it's political. But one of the other things that happened was this perception. Your Ben Shapiro's of the world, your neoconservative types, your institutional establishment Republicans, your Brit Humes who went from ABC to Fox, those kind of guys were like the kind of folks that live in cocktail and upscale suburban culture and places like that, urban culture, etc. In elite communities, cosmopolitan communities, that kind of thing. The kind of people who like the Brits, just an example, classic Anglophiles. So historically, ancestrally, they were saying, hey, the problem is Trump. The reason why that the polls are showing Democrats are competitive again in the House and the Senate races, the Blake Masters behind in Arizona and J.D. Vance is behind in Ohio and Oz is behind in Pennsylvania, and the governors aren't doing competitively and all this stuff. And we'll get to whether the polling data is fake or reliable at all. But their excuse for all of that was, aside from having confidence in public opinion polling data from media and universities in the recent era in the United States, was to say this is Trump. The more there's focus on Trump, it antagonizes independents, it energizes Democrats, that it leads to some drop off of Republican support. And we've got to, push Trump out of the limelight. And we can't be talking about these raids, and we can't be talking about January 6th, and we can't be talking, maybe these are terrible abuses that are happening. However, it doesn't help. It'll hurt the Republicans in the fall. And Mitch McConnell, the turtle, is busy stealing money out of the Republican coffers from people like Blake Masters in Arizona. Now he's going to get into an overt war with Peter Thiel, which is actually a headline article today in a publication. He may second guess the wisdom of that. But basically Thiel has backed a couple of big populist challengers here in the United States for the Senate for his own reasons. He thinks the American system is atrophying at a core and fundamental level. That it's not efficient. And he's very patriotic. He's a nationalist. The people that understand the Putin and Russian mindset can understand where Peter Thiel comes from. If they understand, don't focus on the fact that he's big tech. Don't focus on the fact that he has companies that do business with the government. If you understand he's very patriotic and skeptical of American institutional powers, efficiency, and efficacy, then he's a Putin type and the kind of people who support Putin within Russia. You have a lot of billionaires and oligarchs who are behind Putin, but it's because they share a certain perspective that he has. So just because they're close to the government doesn't mean they're other things. So that's the pitch and the narrative, is that Trump is the problem. Ben Shapiro, who famously said in 2012 Romney was going to win in a romp, that it was going to be an easy win, that it was going to be decided early. Then, of course, predicted quite famously that Donald Trump had no chance in 2016. Didn't even vote for Trump in 2016. The great conservative Ben Shapiro, and has historically been initially Mike Covington kids. He actually attacked him initially. He only changed his opinion later. He was a mask guy, a vaccine guy. This guy has been pretty much wrong on almost everything outside of a very limited subset of issues, which he's a conservative because he's a cultural conservative. So within the American political environment, you have the members of the professional and managerial class that are still conservative are either corporatist or religious conservatives. And that's why they're aligned with the Republican Party. They're not populist. They're mostly pro-war. They don't support economic empowerment of working class communities. They're not willing to sacrifice their $5 discount at Walmart in order to rebuild American manufacturing and industry. They don't believe in infrastructure. They don't believe in they're corporatists who are only conservative because they're religiously conservative on social issues. But they are not populist at all. And so it's not a surprise they've been wrong on almost every issue that has been a populist-tinged issue since their social media influencer existence. But that thesis is completely just false. So let's go to the Alaska example as the example they're going to use for this. Alaska had a special election for the last 4 months prior to the November election, in which where the Palin will be back on the ticket. Alaska decided to do something it's called ranked voting, which is very popular in liberal circles. The way ranked voting works is you vote. You don't cast one vote. You cast however many votes there are candidates on the ballot, and you rank them. Now, the way it has worked in recent time in America is that Democrats and the left are much better at preparing their voter groups for ranked voting than Republicans and conservatives. On paper, there's no reason that this has to be the case. So I'm not as harsh a critic of ranked voting as others are, because ranked voting hypothetically allows for small party candidates to develop a lot more support. And in the process, because it's like, okay, it doesn't matter. My vote isn't being tossed away, because if my candidate doesn't finish in the top 2, then my number 2 choice gets the votes. And then my number 3 choice gets the votes, and so on and so forth. And so there's reasons to believe it has possibility. The fact that Republicans and conservatives have been incompetent at educating themselves about this because they don't like ranked choice voting is more on them, frankly, than the method of voting. But so what happened in Alaska is about 60% of the voters picked Republican candidates in the House race. However, a whole bunch of the ones that voted down ballot for people other than Palin, it wasn't that they voted for the Democrat. A bunch of them just didn't fill out the ballot. They just voted for the first one and skipped who's your second choice. They didn't put one. That is the only reason why Palin lost. They didn't put one. Now, maybe it was deliberate. Maybe it was that Palin has a vestige of negativity in Alaska because after the vice presidential campaign, she left midterm in her governorship because they came after her, was perceived as not being connected to Alaska during that time period. They ran a very nasty campaign against her, dumped a lot of money in because Palin's an independent voice. Whatever people think about Palin, the system fears her because she has a tendency to go off and say whatever she thinks. and advocate whatever her position is, even if it's an anti-institutional, anti-establishment position. And contrary to conventional wisdom, she saved John McCain. Without her, John McCain loses by 15, 16 points. I personally was wanting to see McCain humiliated. I was all for that. There was a Libertarian Party group here in America put up a little meme about John McCain, which I won't share, but it was yeah. Some of those people, they just got it coming. The guy's responsible for what we're seeing in Ukraine today is maybe substantially due to John McCain. So it's like the guy left a legacy of death all around the globe to some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. I'm sorry, when he died, I took out a little champagne. That's just, yeah, some people you can't, when Stalin died, Death of Stalin, great film, great parody for anybody who wants to watch it. I mean, you got to drink something. You got to celebrate when some of these people get whacked. I mean, it's just not a bad thing. I'm not going to cry when Zelensky takes a dirt mat. Palin say, but she had, because of how she was targeted and how she left, there is probably a 20-25% of the Republican base in Alaska that's still agitated at her. They're likely to come back around, and they'll likely fix the issues come November. So Palin is still going to be in the Congress in 2023. This is just a 4-month delay. But those that are trying to make a symbol of it misunderstand what happened in that election. That is purely a one-off due to somewhat unique issues with Palin, but mostly due to ranked choice voting and a bunch of Republicans deciding not to fill out their ranked choice ballot.
Well, can I just say briefly that I can remember as, in my childhood and youth, I used to be a great fan of the FBI, and I'm not making that up. I remember watching all those programs. There was a TV series called The FBI, as I very well remember, which I used to watch. And, I would think this must be the greatest, most finest, most wonderful organization ever. I thought the same about the Metropolitan Police in Britain, by the way, Scotland Yard. And I have to tell you that was just as much of a sewer, as it turned out, as the FBI turned out to be. I have to say, though, that I had thought that the FBI had been cleaned up after Hoover had gone, but it seems not. And there is nothing, there's only one thing worse than a corrupt police organization. And that is a corrupt police organization that is working for one party against another. Having again experienced that in my childhood in Greece, where the military police were very, very much part of the political system and supported some people against other people. That is the most dangerous thing. That is completely incompatible with democracy. A democracy can deal with a corrupt police, but a corrupt partisan police is a massive danger. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Now, thank you for explaining the Sarah Palin story. I can remember, which is extremely, that clarifies it perfectly. I mean, I've understood that entirely now. I can remember back in 2020, during the election, we were getting all those opinion polls. Joe Biden is 20 points ahead. There's going to be a landslide. And I remember sifting through the opinion polls and saying the methodology here is completely wrong. I know a little bit about polling. And in fact, I don't know whether it's still up, but we even did a video about it, Alex. I don't know whether you remember, but we actually did a video about a particular opinion poll which put Biden 20 points in the lead. And it was the same in 2016. The polling data, such as it was, seemed to show Hillary Clinton ahead. The polling data in 2020 it's showing Biden far ahead. And of course, one of the things that we learned as a result of all those WikiLeaks revelations about Hillary Clinton that were the heart of Russiagate is that certain polling agencies were in fact in contact with the Democrats at that time and were actually quite, straightforwardly discussing with the Democrats how the polling data would be provided so that it would put Hillary Clinton in a better position than her opponent. So I'm sorry, I don't trust polling data in the United States. I don't trust it in Britain anymore. Once upon a time, this was an industry that you could rely on. Today, it's become very politicized. It's very connected with powerful commercial and advertising interests, especially in Britain. I mean, the vast majority of work they do is for advertisers in Britain. I don't know whether it's the case in the United States as well. But the result is that I just don't take opinion polls altogether seriously. Now, I'm not saying that one should disregard them entirely, but I think whenever you look at opinion polls in an electoral race, be it in Britain or the United States, you have to accept that there is a bias in favor of one particular party. In Britain, over the last couple of elections, it's been the Labour Party. The Labour Party has always appeared to be polling better than it is. And in the United States, as far as I can see, it's consistently been Democrats. Now, am I wrong there, Robert?
No, I mean, it's basically two things that have happened. One is that polling has become is more art these days than science, and very few people are good at it. And so you have a lot of pretend Picassos who just aren't Picasso. And that's half of it. The other half of it is institutional bias in favor of one side because of where all the incentives align and the political bias of the people doing the polls themselves, both conducting it and overseeing it. So, little brief history of polling in the United States, public opinion polling. What used to be like journalists used to go door to door, bar to bar back in the late 1800s. You could bet on elections here all the time back in the throughout the 1800s, early 1900s. They didn't get banned until later. And so and one way they did so was to get good quality information. Then you had postcard polls. And so people would send out postcards, different publications. I think it was National Literary Digest, say who are you going to vote for. They got back responses. But those polls, of course, tended to be biased towards who responded to postcards and who was a subscriber to the publication. Notoriously predicted that FDR would lose an election that, of course, he didn't in 1932. And so consequently, that opened the door to competitors. In steps George Gallup. And Gallup's initial method of polling, because the whole idea of polling is I'm going to talk to 1,000 people. And by talking to 1,000 people, I'm going to know the opinions of 300 million. So that requires real skill. So the way he started going about it was he went door to door. He hired door-to-door salesman types who knew their communities. And what he wanted was to get samples of groups that members of their group tended to vote alike. So certain rural groups, certain urban groups, certain ethnic groups, certain religious groups, certain geographic groups, certain socioeconomic groups, etc. And he ended up being decent. He still understated Roosevelt's support almost every election because it's just very difficult to get working class participation in a poll, no matter the method. But he was solid and then was decent all the way through and stayed with that method until the early 70s when he shifted to a landline phone. And that's when Americans mostly adopted landline phones. That was usually the only phone in the house. You had a difference between corporate and residential phones. And so they developed a methodology that was pretty decent. And a lot of the media and university pollsters, we mostly just had Gallup. We had Roper and a few other people that would sporadically pop up, but it was basically just Gallup for 40 years. 1980, ABC, some others are experimenting with polling. They don't disclose a lot of their polling, and there's a reason for that. Because it would have been embarrassing. They had Jimmy Carter winning. He lost by almost double digits, got crushed. But that didn't stop him from going in 1984, which, by the way, they had Mondale up at key points in the election. That didn't turn out so well. So media university polling was already off to a little bit of a sketchy start. But there was still enough landlines dominance out there that they could use a certain landline mechanism to reach people, number one. And then number two, the response rate was typically 50% or better. So you weren't getting what's called self-selection bias, where you're only polling the people who want to be polled. Because when you only poll the people who want to be polled, that's going to reflect that audience, not the broader community. Then we got cell phone technology and we got do not call list because of telemarketers bombing the hell out of people in the 1990s. Net effect of that is that by the 2000s, early 2000s, all of a sudden the response rate goes from 50% to 20% to 10% to 5% to now as low as 2%. That does two things. It makes polling much more expensive. So it limits who can do it because you have to call 100 people to get 2 people to respond rather than 100 people to get 50. And that means you got more calls going on and more human labor. And then you also have the cell phone growing problem, which eviscerates the whole landline mechanism of calling. And then you're no longer getting a household. Sometimes you're getting corporate calls. Sometimes you're getting people who aren't registered to vote. Sometimes you're getting people who don't actually live in that jurisdiction their cell phone is associated with, on and on and on. And from that point forward, it got so bad that after the 2012 election, where Gallup missed and thought Romney would win, Gallup says we're not going to poll. The premier gold standard of presidential polling in America says we're never polling presidential elections again. We're done. We're going to maintain our corporate clients, and we're not going to damage it by pretending we can do good presidential polling because we can't. That's how much the metrics had changed to where it was too hard to get an accurate audience, an accurate group. Now, from that point forward, then what happens with all the other pollsters? So they most of them can't poll adequately anymore. Now, the new technologies provide new mechanisms if you're really good at what you do. So if you're a young Richard Barris, People's Pundit, then you know how to use text. You can use text to polls. You can use emails to polls. You can do online panel polling and combine. You can use IVR, which is an automated call system, not rely on a labor-intensive system for calling people. You can call cell phones. You can call landlines. And if you know how to aggregate it, and you know if you're good at the art of polling, like him, you can use these new modes and modalities and be very, very good. And he's been the most consistent, most accurate pollster in America for the last decade. And for people out there, you can find him at People's Pundit Daily or People's Pundit on Locals, People's Pundit on Rumble and YouTube. YouTube suspends him once every couple of weeks. So I do a show with him during the fall coming up during election season every Monday called What Are the Odds, where we do a little bit of a betting, political predicting analysis. But everyone else hasn't done that. Everyone else hasn't adopted these techniques in a very effective way. In steps, now you're right. Where do they make their money? They make their money by getting, for the ones that are the universities, by getting attention, by getting media credibility, media respectability. That's the universe. And then the media pollsters are all make their money off of other polls, off polling for big corporations and companies. So for them, what they need is not to be accurate, because you'd think that's what matters. It isn't. What they need is for their media contracts to continue, for the media to continue to complement their polling. Anybody who has produced results that, and this even includes Fox, that they didn't like, they've canned. CNN actually had some decent pollsters in 2016 at key points. They fired the polling company they'd had for almost 15 years, and instead hired people who are utterly a joke. For those people who don't remember, even in 2018, CNN said that the Democrats were going to win the House vote by 17 points. 17 points. Only wrong by 10 points. That's how bad the error was. Now, so because the media budgets and the media professionals are controlled by Democrats overwhelmingly, there's a institutional incentive for pollsters to skew polls in favor of Democrats. The second problem is the people who oversee the polls, the political science professors, the polling experts. They are all almost to a T liberal Democrats themselves. So that leads to a second level and layer of bias. And there's the people who do the phone calls. This is the problem with exit polling in America. Exit polling has been notoriously wrong, which is always a joke when we condemn some other country's elections and say, "Oh, the exit polls say, our exit polls are crap." I used to make money just betting against the exit polls. I would wait for the exit polls to come out because they would be leaked to the press early on during the election day, and I would bet the other way because it was consistently wrong. Made tons of money betting on old corrupt George W. Bush in 2004 that way. Always bet on the crook. It's just general advice in politics. But given that, they have all the incentives, all the institutional biases and prejudices to favor Democrats. And we now know that beyond any doubt. Not just obviously in the terrible Brexit polling that took place in the UK, all over favoring Labour consistently in many of the elections in the UK. But here in the States, 2014, the average error in the United States Senate races, because everybody's making a big deal of these summer polls, these August polls. So I went back and looked. In the summer, the average poll in the 2014 competitive U.S. Senate races overstated the Democratic support by an average rate of 7 points. At least 7 points. It said the Democrat would do 7 points better than they actually did. 2016, the average error was anywhere from 6 to 10 points, depending on which poll you were looking at and which state you were looking at. In 2018, what people missed is that even though it was an extremely favorable Democratic electoral environment, the polls were still wrong, with an average error of 7 points in the U.S. Senate races again. And in 2020, same pattern. So what you have, especially in U.S. Senate races, so when you have a Senate candidate come out that's less known than the other side, that maybe had a competitive primary when the other didn't, there's usually a problem with that for the first month or so, with that candidate rallying the base. In other words, you just went through a competitive primary. There's still people agitated at you that voted for somebody else, whereas your opponent didn't have that, so your opponent has a bigger cushion. If you dig into the data, you find out what you really care about is where independents trending, where people who didn't vote in the primary trending, things like this, where are working class groups going, if you want to use the polling data for anything useful, which is mostly limited for. Once you do that, Blake Masters is actually in great shape to win in Arizona. J.D. Vance is going to win with ease in Ohio. Oz is likely to win in Pennsylvania. But it turns out nominating stroke candidates is not a good idea. As if the guy can't debate because he clearly can't talk. He's clearly had major issues. And he got that stroke after he took a little shot, by the way. Democrats, you reap what they sow. Wisconsin's not going to be as competitive as they think. Ron Johnson's going to walk in. Georgia, Herschel Walker's going to win with ease. I put up my political betting predictions at a place called sportspicks.locals.com. That's where you can find whatever I think of the best political odds are in the current betting markets. Your best betting markets are still in the United Kingdom. Betfair is by far the best. The Brits are the best at betting on politics. Why we don't have more of that here in America drives me crazy. But all that polling information is mostly unreliable. Assume an average margin of error of 7 points from the summer polls. Assume 3 to 5 points at least for the fall polls. And what's more important is recent trends, economic data, and the political environment, not the public opinion polling. Models that even liberal leftists who've used those models have said, look, those models are all telling us Democrats are going to get wiped out. And this includes, I think, it'll be a surprise to people in some governor's races in Wisconsin and in Michigan and in Pennsylvania, where Republicans are seen as big underdogs. I think they're going to win 2 of those 3, maybe all 3. It's going to be a sweep. Now, it's probably good for those of us that don't want another war, that Democrats and the media think they might still keep the House, that they're going to hold the Senate, that they're going to hold the governorship. Because as long as they think they may win in November, they're less likely to do an October surprise that might be an October surprise on the whole world.
Thanks. That was masterly, Robert, and that explains a great deal. And thank you for your description of polling and the history of polling. Something, by the way, which is an American invention. I mean, it's completely open. George Gallup's ideas were taken up absolutely everywhere. I think there is going to be an October surprise, except I don't think it's going to be one that the Democrats are going to make. And maybe it shouldn't be considered a surprise either, because we have really, really bad economic numbers. Now, I think you're to some extent insulated from this in the US, because I don't think you quite know in the US how really bad things outside the US actually are becoming. In Britain, the situation now is borderline catastrophic. There's talk that we might cease to be considered any longer a sort of stable first-rank economic power. In Germany, factories are starting to shut. They're not operating. Now, of course, they're not theoretically closing in the sense that they're not liquidating. But when a factory shuts, the owner loses money. And sooner or later, it becomes impossible to keep the factory to go, intact. And of course, at that point, it does permanently close. There are stresses building up in the banking system and the financial system. There's a really good article about this by Eve Smith recently. I'm talking about the European financial system. And I think this is absolutely true. There is a definite, at least in Europe, there is a whiff of panic, certainly in Europe. And if you go further east, to the Far East, things are not great there either. I was looking at South Korea, for example, country which we all think of as an economic success story. Its currency is under severe pressure. Its trade deficit is rising. It's in great difficulties. And of course, in China itself, this huge juggernaut of an economy that we've all been so awed by over the last 20 years, 30 years. Well, things are definitely not as they were. I mean, though I think that the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, is going to start reflating its economy. It's going to try to increase, to boost economic growth over the next few weeks, because that's what it always does. At which point, of course, we're going to see oil prices starting to rise. And, you know, they've sort of whizzed up and then they've fallen back to a certain distance and then they go up again. And if you look, it always seems to be that the declines are never permanent. The rises always come. And of course, if China starts to try and grow itself out of problems, then of course the oil price is going to rise a lot more. So we're going to have all of this coming. And I suspect September, October, November maybe, is when it's all going to hit home. In other words, just in time for the midterms. And I'm going to say this, I think the United States, because of the nature of its economy, it's still self-sufficient in many things. It's not so dependent on imports of oil and gas, and it's got still a big manufacturing sector and all those things. It's going to be protected, but only to a certain degree. And if the global economy falls off a cliff, and if prices at the same time start rising, still continue rising, because of course, Jerome Powell said this very interesting thing. He said that the Fed cannot control the supply side. It can control monetary policy, but it can't conjure up oil or food or fertilizer or titanium. It doesn't have that power. If those prices, there's pressure on those prices still continues, and I understand that the condition in oil markets is still very tight, in fact, remains very tight, then I'm going to make a guess that all these calculations the Democrats are making about, you come after Donald Trump, you play around with affidavits, you do all of these things, you try to motivate your base, you talk about Sarah Palin not doing so well in Alaska, you hope that the opinion polls this time are more reliable than they were, and you make sure that they point in a certain way. All of that is going to mean absolutely nothing. If people in October feel that the economy, their conditions of life are going badly wrong, then the Democrats can kiss goodbye to Congress. It won't just be a landslide. It will be a wipeout. That's what I think anyway.
Absolutely. And I think the fundamentals are what I think are always more useful than public opinion polling. And the fundamentals that have been relevant, particularly in the modern era. So, like, if you went back longer, the midterm data going back to, say, the 1930s, 1920s, the beginning of a meaningful, robust primary era in America, in the sense that primary elections became more involved in the party conventions at certain levels of picking candidates, there was less consistent data with midterms. That all changed beginning really in 2004. So a good book on this, in part, called The Big Sort, talking about the politicization of cultural and lifestyle differences in America, whereby you picked where you lived, literally where you lived, based on your politics, particularly more self-segregation by the left than by the right, but it had the same effect because of the left moving away from the right. And this was moving from rural areas to urban areas, moving to certain neighborhoods within those urban areas, wanting to be near neighbors who think like you. And that bit, and then also in cultural affiliations, religious denominations, social clubs, you name it. Methods of socialization, interaction, the recreation of that through social media and Facebook and Twitter that enhance YouTube, that re-enhance that, so that you could really live amongst your own politically. You could completely avoid any dissident voice if you wanted to. And this is why these people are always shocked when there is a dissident voice. They truly don't. They think dissident voices are weird, marginal, crazy extremists, like the Biden administration is currently doing by trying to demonize the 75 plus million Americans who voted for President Trump, as they're doing lately. And it is, as the super chatter notes, a pattern of trying to replace governments or sort of what Jack Posobiec is calling a preemptive coup of 2024. How do they keep Trump out of the White House kind of strategy? And part of that is to demonize his supporters. But but since 2004, everything changed in the sense that we got such a hardcore cultural gap and the politicization of that cultural gap in America that your identity, particularly more on the left, but it had the same effect on the right, ultimately, just by its impact, its consequential impact, is that our elections are have developed a different pattern. So, for example, president seeking re-election won easy in Roosevelt in 36, 40, and 44. Truman ultimately, despite the polling, first great polling era in 1948, won actually pretty easily. Eisenhower easily in 56. LBJ easy in 1964. Nixon easy in 1972. Reagan easy in 1984. Clinton easy in 1996. So that was the normal pattern of presidential re-elections. That all stopped in 04. George W. Bush barely won. Barack Obama barely won. Some of us think Trump barely won, but however you put it, it was very, very close. So the old game was gone. The other thing that changed was midterms. Prior to 2004, it was rare for there to be a massive change and shift in a midterm election. You had elections like 1994 and parts of 1986 in the Senate and 74 with the reformist and 66 with the blowback against the Great Society, but it was more exceptional than normal. Not 1934 opposition to the New Deal from the left itself with the Upton Sinclair and Huey Long and others. Not since 2004. 2006, massive shift to the party out of power. 2010, massive shift to the party out of power. 2014, massive shift to the party out of power. 2018, massive shift to the party out of power. So recent trends tell us there's going to be a massive shift. House is going to go heavily Republican, probably 250 or more Republican seats in the House. I'm sticking with that same prediction I made months ago, that Republicans will have the Senate. And the only question is number. I'd currently put it at 53. If I was doing odds, 53 and a half, for those that like odds, you always add a half so you can guarantee a winner or loser. And that Republicans add governorships, including it's two of the three, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. They're currently thought to have no shot at, and they hold Arizona and Georgia with these. So that's what the broader trends show. And as you point out, the second critical factor is the economy. Third critical factor is the political context. And in the economy, as you point, the Fed is pretending they can control inflation, and they're willing to do it by busting the stock market and also busting the real estate market. There have been predictions by a bunch of doves that the Fed would forfeit this when they saw the stock market going down and the house market going down. They went to their, one of their another elite places. They always got to get, it's always got to be Aspen or Davos or something, Jackson Hole. Well, why don't you go to Flint, Fed? At least it'd be interesting. But so they're there to have their little cups of tea and look at the skies and ski and all that crap. But they came out and to their surprise, or some surprise, not Tom Longo's surprise, but some people's surprise, they're doubling down. They believe they can control inflation. They believe they can do so by increasing interest rates. They are going to keep doing so throughout the whole year. What some people like Snyder and people that are in the alternative economic space, some would put it Austrian school, things of that nature. What their view is that in fact the Fed it's mythical that they can control inflation. That once you print as much money as we printed, this was Putin's point in his speech, a few months ago, you can't print that much money and not have problems. It's simple math. And you can't put that genie back in easily again. So inflation is here to stay. It may come, the rate of inflation may come down, but we aren't returning to 2019 prices anytime soon. We're not returning to 2019 labor markets. Like the Biden administration did a big thing. Hey, look at jobs. We got all these jobs. Then they looked at it and they're like, well, how is it the labor force participation rate is still low? Oh, it's because people are taking 2 jobs and taking 3 jobs and taking 4 jobs. That's not a great economy. Hey, look, you used to have 2 people with 1 job. Now 1 person has 2. Woohoo! That's not a winner. And so the economy, everything you mentioned, Alexander, everything looks bad. And there's no reason. And Europe's about to really squeeze. I mean, they're running around begging Germany, trying to chop down the random trees, trying to see how much wood they can get in those fireplaces that Germany banned from their homes some years ago. So I wonder how that all's going. They're going to put some chimneys up suddenly, while they're not going to do nuclear power. And then you compound that, as you note, China has issues. And so all the fundamentals, and then Biden's job approval is really, if it was honest polling, is all in the 30s. All of that says massive blowout Republicans. Nothing's changing my mind on that. Short-term predictability is the same factoring because, as you point out, the main variable is war and the economy between now and then. And both of those do not look promising. Now, hopefully we don't escalate, God forbid. But you look at the Ukraine is going bad. But I follow a lot of your, some people call them OSINT, open source intelligence guys. And a lot of these guys are former Army intelligence, former CIA, a lot of them are think tanks. They're still in delusion. Every day, like if you go to the Drudge Report, and the Drudge Report, for people who don't know, Drudge sold it years ago. He sold it in secret because that was the deal that he wasn't going to disclose. But there's a reason why his Twitter account went suddenly mute entirely. It's because he's not there. So that's why the Drudge Report has shifted from being the anti-institutional narrative to being the institutional narrative. If you want to know what the editors at the Politico or the New York Times, what the various publishers or the various production assistants at even Fox News, what they're looking for each day, they go to Drudge Report. If you went to Drudge Report last week, Putin was just about to be overthrown. Again, the generals are major problems throughout Russia. All the generals, there's major problems. They're still just really not doing well in Ukraine. Not only that, the Yale economists have done an analysis, and the economy is just about to collapse. This is the kind of nonsense that's being put out by the institutional narrative. They still believe this. The OSINT world that people like Armchair Warlord and others made fun of, it's still delusional. I mean, I get daily substacks about how Russia's just about to lose. The counteroffensive was really a super secret duping strategy of the Russians. I mean, like as Russians with Attitude put out today, that one new theory was the Ukrainians are not going to disclose which towns they've taken from the Russians in order to hide it from the Russians. It's like, how do you hide a town you just took from them? How does that work? So, I mean, this is the insanity. While, Zelensky's busy renting one of his many global mansions, this one in Italy, ironically to a Russian couple because he needs the cash. So Russians aren't supposed to go to Europe, but unless you're going to Zelensky, one of his many mansions, then it's okay because the dude's got to feed the coke habit. He's got to dance to the Colombian marching band. So so all of those dynamics present more risk for the Democrats in the fall. I hope they believe, though, that they think they can win, because the greatest risk I see is we're continuing to see little escalations in China. And you combine China's internal issues, Xi's up to be renominated head of the party. They've got a major water problem, a major heat wave problem, and that impacts their food, that impacts their hydropower, which is very critical to what they do. On top of their insane zero COVID strategy. Even within China, you're starting to see some dissent of think tanks like, maybe it's time to shift away from zero COVID. Maybe that's not really maybe we can't shut down our supply chain every couple of months, but they're still doing it right now because it's the ultimate statist dream. It's like why Cuba obsessed over it and sunk their economy and almost triggered a political rebellion. Zero COVID is a class. It justifies the state. Why do we as a state exist? Because we protect you from disease. That's how important we are. That's how beneficial we are. It fits the Munchausen syndrome by proxy that so many state bureaucrats have, that they're there to protect you and to help you and to save you. And so they're going to be naturally addicted to something like zero COVID, even when all the empirical evidence says it's insane, or has been exposed in the UK this past couple of weeks. They didn't have any basis to do a lot of what they're doing, just like got exposed in Canada. They're just like, let's wing it. Let's do that. I mean, they didn't do it. There was no risk benefit analysis. It never was done. Nobody sat down and said, what's the risk of preventing kids from being educated in direct personal in-person method for a year and a half? Well, now we know biggest drop in test scores in parts of the United States that have ever occurred. And other things like that. What happens on suicide rates? Well, now we know they spiked. What happens with drug addictions? Well, and deaths related to it. Drug and alcohol overdoses spiked, and they spiked directly proportionate to the lockdowns. But they never even did an assessment. They never even looked at it. China is still equally insane, but you combine zero COVID with their water problems, with the broader impacts of different things happening in the economy, with their, particularly in real estate and banking, because they built ghost cities. They were getting people to put all of their excess capital in domestic investments to have second and third homes. They were putting the homes up in shoddy ways. They were financing them in questionable ways. Local governments were completely complicit in it. They got a terrible real estate bubble that will ripple out throughout the banking system. Now, there's like on YouTube, the great financial experts are predicting, in 24 days, China's economy will totally collapse, or maybe it's 21, or maybe it's 29. It reminds me of the Manchurian candidate scene where he's trying to remember how many commies are in the State Department. And they're like, Heinz 57. Oh, there's 57 commies from the Heinz 57 bottle, so he could remember the number. That's not going to happen. But the Xi has every incentive in the world to, especially if he thinks that he can manage it and sustain it, to prove the Chinese military is not a paper tiger, to take back Taiwan as part of the sort of nationalistic pride, to take it back. For the imperialists are giving him the excuse within the internal Chinese political dialogue, given how much, Colonel McGregor did a great breakdown when he explained that China's built its whole system like it's the early 1800s from a military perspective, that they're still obsessed with how the imperialists broke up China. And in their minds, they did. The Brits, man, they were just feeding that opium right in there. Come on. That's why Hong Kong is Hong Kong. It's a great little pirate drug dealer. One of the greatest. They say crime doesn't pay. That's the guy who helped found Hong Kong. Sure paid for him. His family's still getting money out of that with major economic enterprises in Hong Kong. But, that how all their military is defined defensively more than offensively. Which I thought was very interesting, but in such that nobody could practically invade China and think they're going to win, independent of the nuclear power. But that would mean it could, if you're Xi, you got internal economic issues from a range of things within your control and without your control, but you're not willing to change at the moment. You got a renomination to be head of the party coming up. You've got the imperialist in his mind giving you the pretext to go into Taiwan, take back Taiwan. And you have a Biden, and the degree that a Biden administration is panicking and think they're going to collapse in November, that really escalates the risk. And, I think today Taiwan shot down some Chinese drones. There's always a little up, 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 a little up. And that presents real risk. Now, from a domestic political perspective, I think any Chinese conflict would go over as well as the Ukrainian one did, which, as we talked about at the time, there's always a short-term boost. Once the reality sits in, Ukraine was not going to be a popular conflict in the United States, and it's not been a popular conflict in the United States. Everybody who voted for those budgets looked like idiots, and you don't hear them bragging about it anywhere on the campaign trail or anywhere else. Now, in Europe, you'll have somebody saying, I care more about Ukraine than my own country. I'll sacrifice my country's economy for Ukraine. That's how nuts these EU bureaucrats are. Shows how anti-nationalist they are at a core level. They don't care about their own people, their own country, the people that elected them to the positions of power. But I think there is still, to the degree there's a October surprise that's a war risk. From an economic perspective, I think you're absolutely right. It's going to continue to sink. It's not. We're facing stagnation. It's the 1970s all over again, and it will take some time to get out of it. And with our current set of policies, we won't. You can't send more money with student loan forgiveness, hoping that's going to inflate the economy while you're trying to deflate the economy, while you're trying to hold up the real estate and the stock market. Stock market's likely to come down. Michael Burry of The Big Short has sold all of his stocks except for like prison companies and some things that you don't want. It's like, hold on, he's predicting that the world's going to look like, some futuristic dystopian film. And he's like, I bet prisons are going to make some money in the future. That's all. That's the guy who was behind The Big Short. Christian Bale played him in the movie. That's who that guy is. He's saying the stock market's going to have like a 50% caliber collapse. Jamie Dimon, head of Chase Bank, is privately telling his VIP wealthy clients, there's about a 30% chance of something worse than a recession. What's worse than a recession? Call that a depression. That's what they call that. So the economic risk tea leaves say we're much higher risk to go down than up in the near short term. And the war risk is not de-escalating anytime soon. And if it does escalate, it's not going to be popular. While there's a lot of reasons why conservatives distrust and dislike China, the idea of going to war with China is not a popular idea, as Trump has articulated effectively. He's like, this is just dumb. There's no upside to this. We're just provoking them, and we're giving them the pretext that they want, if they want that, if you see China from that perspective. So I think the only question is what's the risk we do go to war with China? I go back and forth. The more I think Democrats here think they're going to win, I think that risk goes down. The more they think they're going to lose, the more that risk goes up.
I completely agree. I think this is completely right. Can I just first of all touch on a few points you've made about central banks thinking that they can control inflation? Well, of course they think they can control inflation, or they want us to think that they can control inflation, because if they can't control inflation, what is the point of them at the end of the day? So Jerome Powell is not going to just give up on his interest rate increases if inflation rises. He's going to keep on doing it because he's got to keep his credibility and that of his institution intact in some ways, because if he basically gives up and says, well, actually, there's nothing I can do. Inflation is going to go on rising because I can't ultimately control the supply side things of prices at all. So I might as well just leave interest rates where they are. Well, people will start to say, well, what is the point of you then? And what is the point of your institution? And what does it actually do if you can't actually protect the value of our money? That's what a central bank is supposed to do. So the most interesting thing about Jerome Powell was not just that he admitted that they don't really have control over the supply side. For me, it was that he spoke for all of 9 minutes. Now, that shows that he doesn't want to discuss things. That, to my mind, tells you how bad he knows things are. Because just as Ukraine doesn't want to tell us the cities it's liberated, so Jerome Powell doesn't want to tell us, how, the inflation numbers are really out of his control, and that he can raise interest rates however much he wants. But, ultimately, the underlying problems are not going to be solvable that easily. And of course, from Jerome Powell's point of view, from anybody who is concerned about the inflationary crisis which we have, which is an inflationary crisis, and anybody who's lived through an inflationary crisis, I have lived through an inflationary crisis. I have lived through the 1970s. I remember it very well. Everybody who has done that knows that what ultimately drives inflation upwards is too much money in the economy, as well as supply side problems, obviously. Where does that money come from? It comes from central banks when they print it. It comes from governments when they spend it. And in the United States, over the last 2 years, we have had a government which has been recklessly overspending. Anybody who goes back and looks at our programs on the Duran, and I know this is also true of yourself, Robert. I mean, you've been saying the same things. You reel back 2 years, and we saw what Biden's program was going to be when he became president. I remember we were all saying, this is going to result in a massive increase in inflation. It is bound to have inflationary results. You can't run an economy so hot and not expect that it will spill over into inflation. And of course, they persisted in doing it. They put the foot down ever more on the financial and monetary accelerator. And of course, they told us it didn't really matter because it was all going to be transitory. And what has happened is that they've infected the entire global economy with the inflation that they've generated within the United States. Because remember, whatever you may think about, the future of the dollar, and, you can talk about that at length, at the moment, it remains the world's reserve currency. And that means that if there's an inflation situation in the United States, it automatically transmits itself globally. If you then create a supply side crisis on top of that by imposing sanctions on the world's biggest commodity producer, then you're going to make that inflation crisis worse. And if you're going to start taking, in the middle of that inflation crisis, decisions like cancelling student loans and giving money out to more of your friends in various industries and things. And I have to say, the Anti-Inflation Act for me was perhaps the most misnamed and incorrectly named act I've ever seen, because it's not anti-inflation. It's going to, I say this, I have a good record here. It is going to increase inflationary pressures even more. If you're going to go on behaving like that, well, of course, you're going to get more inflation. And of course, inflation, and this is the thing people don't understand, ultimately crushes demand. Because unless you let wages rise and pensions rise and all those sort of things rise, in which case you can be in an inflationary cycle, which is going to take off, into the sky, and that's how you can end up in a hyperinflation situation. Unless you do that, if you start trying to rein some things in, like wages, for example, then because prices are rising and because interest rates are rising, you are going to create a collapse in demand. And a collapse in demand leads to recession. Now, and in this case, a particularly bad one. By the way, can I just say, underlying all of China's other problems, they have been doing some of this too. That property bubble didn't come out of nowhere. They also have been massively, recklessly overspending. They've been doing it not through interest rates and quantitative easing and even government spending. They've been doing it by letting the banking system run rip. And banks, in a way, create money as well. There's been far too much liquid money in China over far too long. It's what's made it possible for China's economy to grow so fast over the last 15 or so years. But of course, there is now a price to pay. And again, the price is in the instabilities that Robert was describing within the Chinese economy. So I just wanted to clarify this. If we're talking about a recession and an inflation crisis in the United States and globally, be under no doubt about who bears the ultimate responsibility for this. It is the people in the White House and in the Democratic Party, aided and abetted by various others, but they, and I should say by a claque of economists who I find clearly don't understand economics, but they have created this crisis, and it was completely predictable, and it was predicted, not least by the three of us. And we don't have the inside knowledge of the data streams that the people in the White House and the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve Board have, but we could see that this inflation that they were generating was not going to be transitory. Now, this brings me to the war, because I completely agree with you that about China. The Chinese, for whatever reason, they're incredibly sensitive about the issue of Taiwan. Actually, it's not difficult to see their reasons. It's very much related to their history. Lieutenant Colonel McGregor was talking about the terrible experiences they had in the 19th century. You're absolutely right to say that we in Britain have never had a proper reckoning about that. You have all these institutions like HSBC and others, all these colonial companies, which are still there, by the way. They're still very active. I'm not going to name them. I don't want to invite any problems for myself, as you can probably guess. But anyway, they're all still there in Britain. We've never made that accounting to ourselves about what we did to China in the 19th century, which, to be clear, was brutal. I mean, it was horrible. And by the way, and just in passing, the Chinese in those days contrasted the United States with Britain, the predatory power, which was the one, which was the other power led by people who preferred to keep things to themselves. And Chinese people in the 19th century, if you read their literature of that time, they had a very, very favorable image of the United States precisely for that reason, because it wasn't seen as a predatory imperial power. But anyway, that's in passing. Anyway, for all these reasons, Xi Jinping is not going to retreat on Taiwan. I don't think he's looking for a war. I think he knows how risky war is, and who in their senses anyway wants a war with the United States. So I don't think he wants it, but I don't think people in Washington understand the pressures that he is under. The fact that he simply can't be seen to retreat on this. His position is not totally solid in China. He has to get re-elected or reappointed chairman or president. So he's got to sort that out. He can't afford to be seen to back off on Taiwan. He's been as conciliatory, I think, as he's able to be, which maybe isn't conciliatory in the eyes of some people. From the Chinese side, he's avoided taking the big steps that perhaps some Chinese people would like him to take. And if the United States presses ahead with these ideas like this, apparently now just a few weeks after Pelosi's visit, there's talk of a $1 billion arms sales by the United States to Taiwan. There will come eventually a breaking point, and it's not impossible that it could come at some point over the next few weeks and months, given the political problems in China. Now, I don't think people in the US in general understand this. I don't think they grasp how precarious the situation is. And I don't think they understand something else, which is that personal relations between Biden and Xi Jinping have completely collapsed. Xi Jinping has made it absolutely clear that he doesn't trust Biden anymore. He thinks that Biden is either incapable of running his administration, or worse still, that when he talks about Taiwan, he's actually lying to him. And that is a very dangerous situation indeed. I personally think we probably will get through the autumn. I think we will avoid a crisis before November. I think Xi thinks that he's strong enough to get re-elected without having a crisis. And I don't think people in Washington are looking for a crisis in that way at the moment. But it's touch and go. And we could be there, and we could be there within weeks. And I don't think people in the United States are ready.
Yeah, no, I not at all. And I think it's the way I've described it when it comes to China is that one can have skepticism and disagreement of China's totalitarian system, of the social credit system that I know some of my friends on the pro-China side pretend doesn't exist. Ask the guy who tried to protest outside of the bank, who suddenly had a COVID flag on his cell phone that prevented him from leaving his home. Some of us would call that a social credit system. But there's one can be critical of the Chinese system of governance, while at the same time being skeptical and disfavoring any kind of military martial conflict or war, as Colonel McGregor has well articulated. It's like, it's idiotic. It was a dumb idea, so why do it? And the key for China is having the same the equivalent of Colonel McGregor within their political structure to make those same decisions. But as you note, at some point they will push it so far. And given his domestic internal issues, it provides an easy political pretext for him to maintain and sustain. It puts more pressure on him to sustain face in Taiwan. Cannot sacrifice it with the domestic problems he has on the economic side. Because to some degree, it's the first time in decades, a generation or two, that China is suddenly facing some of these economic issues. I mean, they've been on just a whoo for about 30 years. Now, largely now, and that's also remind my friends on the left, or on the I guess they might say anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, whatever how they may define themselves. There's a tendency going back more than a century for those skeptical and critical of the West, of Britain, of America, of empire, of deep state, military, however you label it, the adventurism of corporatists, to embrace their opposition and to deny that the enemy of their enemy is always their friend. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is just another enemy, and that they miss like most famously Noam Chomsky with Khmer Rouge. But examples of this included trying to deny the Holodomor in the 1920s, 1930s, done by, I mean, there were multiple Soviet famines, but done famously by Walter Duran for the New York Times, who got a prize for it, much as they would later get a prize for Russiagate. The Laura Logan's actually, interestingly, the old CBS reporter is producing a alternative to the National Press Club called the American Press Club. So, and one of her primary points was we need to award people who actually write actual journalism. No more Russiagate awards, things like that. But then again, flash forward, many in the left had thought that everything that was anti-Stalin was just Western propaganda, capitalist propaganda, whatever label that was used on it. And many of them were shocked when Khrushchev's speech leaked. Because they'd spent decades claiming that was all myth, that was all propaganda. Same with Mao in the 1960s. I mean, every great step forward was like 3 great steps back. I mean, millions, hundreds of, up to 100 million, at least tens of millions of deaths are on Mao and his utter disastrous set of policies. See, that's what zero COVID reminds me of. It's another insane statist mindset. Then you have Vietnam. Famously, Jane Fonda, others sided with Ho Chi Minh in the North Vietnam. Again, you could oppose the Vietnam War without being for Ho Chi Minh. The same in with famously, Noam Chomsky damaged his credibility terminally with some people because he defended the Khmer Rouge and he attacked journalists who were exposing the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And he's like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're buying into propaganda." And then, of course, a lot of claims made about the Soviet Union turned out untrue by 1989 when it collapsed. I see right now people on the left, the long-standing excuses for Cuba's mismanagement of its sugar part of its economy, blaming everything that every bad problem Cuba's ever had is solely due to sanctions. It can't possibly be because they don't know how to manage their sugar economy. They don't know how to manage domestic. That couldn't possibly be an explanation, even though they have access to the entire globe outside of the U.S. It's like, I'm not a fan of sanctions. I oppose the sanctions. I think they're dumb policies. One of the reasons why is because they just give a pretext for regimes to harm their domestic populations and fail to actually produce economically, socially, or politically. But at the same time, it's like, I've been to Cuba many times. I know plenty of people that are from Cuba and have left Cuba, including people that are still there, and they're very critical, justifiably, of how their government functions in terms of the economy. And it's because they mismanage it. The state is a lousy mechanism of measuring and managing an economy by almost all of human history, whether it's the king or whether it's anyone else or commies or anybody else. But right now, I saw a whole Twitter thread trying to convince everybody in the anti-war, anti-establishment side, but more from the left perspective, that North Korea is really okay, not that bad at all, and that all the North Korean refugees are fake. They're just these fake, totally made up. And it's like, and the mistake they make is, I often get from them, they'll say, "How in the world can you trust Western sources when when you don't trust them on Russia, Ukraine, or a whole bunch of other issues?" Well, first of all, it's not mostly Western sources in many of these cases. I'll give an example of Venezuela that I'm trusting. But putting that aside, the reverse is also true. Just because the United States government says something doesn't make it true. Just because the United States government says something doesn't mean it's automatically false either. And that's the problem that a lot of the establishment, the people that are trying to convince me that China is a thriving rule of law governing democracy. Okay, good luck with that. I think the people that even like with Russia try to convince me the Brittany Griner case was a legitimate case. Yeah, all right. I mean, we can oppose war, oppose conflict, and still be realistic and not make the mistake the anti-war movement made, going all the way back in the left made since the 20s, excusing and apologizing for totalitarian regimes merely because those regimes may at various times be opposed to the United States, or because because going to war or escalating conflict with those regimes or economic sanctions is a bad policy idea for the globe. One can distinguish the two. But I see a lot of friends on the left, because of what happened with Russia and Ukraine, start to think that everything ever said bad about China is not true. Ask the Falun Gong. Ask Harry Wu, labor activist I worked for when I was working for labor unions back in the 1990s. You can ask people different parts of Taiwan and Hong Kong or the Uyghurs. Now, that doesn't mean there hasn't been a lot of exaggeration about some of those claims, particularly the Uyghurs, but ask Tibet. I had, a long discussion with Senator Monahan's daughter, who's big on Tibet. I know plenty of people that have been involved in the Tibet movement now for decades. The idea, that's my source. It's not the State Department. It's not the CIA. Take Venezuela. You can say that, Hugo Chavez wasn't quite the person that people demonized him to be, and that the sanctions are a self-defeating set of policies as it relates to it. And that socialism isn't quite the explanation for Venezuela's oil dependency, which its economy has always gone up and down as oil's gone up and down. Well, at the same time, recognizing there's a lot of corruption involving Maduro, and you don't need to take the State Department as a source. A left-wing documentarian went down to Venezuela to talk to original Chavez supporters, working-class Venezuelans, who are harshly critical of the Maduro regime is corrupt. So God bless Max Blumenthal, but everybody on the left that keeps apologizing for some of these regimes undermines their credibility on everything else where they're right. And I think they should take the same kind of skepticism they applied to U.S. governmental statements in the West, apply it to China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, anywhere else as well, and try to continue to employ disciplined methodologies and original sources where you can get it. It's because of China we have difficulty getting accurate information out of China. That's China. It's a censorship-driven society. People want to pretend it isn't, okay, but that I don't think that would hold up to reality. But you're right that in America there's complete misunderstanding of China. McGregor gave the best analysis that I had seen from a U.S. source, U.S. government, ex-government source in this case, of explaining how, it's like Russia, some parts of Europe. There's large parts of the world that what happened 200 years ago still really matters in their political public consciousness. In America, that would seem kind of weird. I mean, the American Revolution mattered, et cetera, but like how some country treated us in 1840 is not part of our public consciousness very much. We get along great with the Brits now, and we threw them out. So it's that kind of mindset. But you see it with my senator from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn, who she's got a grandstand and go to Taiwan. That nitwit governor from Arizona who couldn't do the elections right, he's retired. He's taking a trip to Taiwan. They all got to get on the Taiwan action. And they think of it like that EU foreign minister or whichever government she's a part of that was like, hey, I'm going to choose Ukraine over my own country. They think it's that kind of symbol, like Boris, Bojos, who keep hopping over to Kiev and I really am Churchill. I really am Churchill. I'm not a loser who got kicked out of office within about a year. No, when I had a huge mandate and a natural coalition and a weakened opposition, I didn't just blow it over dumb COVID policies in Ukraine. No, that didn't happen. I'm still, leading the Winston Churchill fight. She went over there and she goes, and this tells you about the mindset we talked about briefly before in parts of the American political right about China and Taiwan and the misunderstandings that are present. She goes and visits Chiang Kai-shek's memorial. She doesn't know that that's controversial even within Taiwan. She's utterly unaware of it. She's like, oh, they're going to love me now. I'm going to go to the Chiang Kai-shek memorial. Unaware that Taiwan was really a dictatorship for many decades when he was there, not some functioning public participation regime that was suppressing the local population. None of that, because it's not in her consciousness. If the average American political right individual thinks of Taiwan as the place where the freedom fighters had to flee to when fighting Mao and the commies, and that they're the real Chinese leadership, I mean, that's how we treated them for I guess almost 30 years. We called Taiwan the People's Republic of China. I mean, I get it, but at some point you can't pretend it's like when we were doing that fake Venezuelan president guy. You can't keep pretending, that this is like Peter Sellers Being There movie or something, that these people are leaders. But in their mindset, that's all Taiwan was. Taiwan is this country founded by the freedom fighters, founded by the freedom lovers, supporting freedom, escaping Mao, holding on to the torch of liberty. And that's who they still are today. And Taiwan is desperate to be completely independent and outside of the Chinese yoke. and that there's this little island standing up, as Kamala Harris describes Ukraine. Remember, they're the little guy against the big guy, and we side with the little guy. We don't side with the little guy hardly ever. I mean, that's just not political reality in American deep state influence over time. But unless the little guy's us. So, but the idea that this is a little island country of freedom fighters and liberty believers and holding the flame and have a great boosting critical computer chip economy that's essential to the global economy. So we are going to stand against this big bully China. And that's how they see it. That's why they're eager to be on the Taiwanese side. It's like they all want to pretend that they're playing a reality game of World War II. And that they're standing up against Hitler. They're making the noble grand stand. This is how they've been educated throughout the universities and in the graduate schools and in their think tanks. And that's who that's why they do things that she didn't even realize that would be controversial in Taiwan, because he is controversial in Taiwan. It's just as some of the people who think Taiwan would welcome Chinese invasion are a little nuts. I mean, 56% of the country voted for independence in a landslide last election for the independence-aligned parties. At the same time, 40% were willing to, and ironically, that's a lot of people tied to the Chiang Kai-shek regime, because of economic reasons, but also cultural, linguistic, and historical ancestral reasons. 3/4 of the people in Taiwan at the time Chiang Kai-shek went there were native Chinese, not part of the fleeing Chinese army. Those core facts are just the complexity of Taiwan is not understood at all in the American political right. They see it like they see Ukraine. They see it as like Ukraine is these noble advocates for independence and freedom and democracy and sovereignty. And they're just this big country, but little people against the big bad bully Putin, who just wants to re-Sovietize Europe. They see the same as that's why they see Solomon Islands within that context. And you have people whose grandparents were in the World War II theater in the Pacific, and they remember freeing places like the Solomon Islands. And so they're like, hold on a second, Solomon Islands part of China? And they have an instinctive opposition. So that's part of the political history as well. But primarily, you have high-ranking United States senators and governors and state officials who truly have a delusional understanding of Taiwan's internal politics and totally miss the importance and significance, which mostly isn't taught in the States, of the early 19th century in China and the imperial powers' attempts to divvy it up and force opium upon it. I mean, we literally fought the Brits, not we Americans. People pointed that out to me last time. The Americans were not part of that particular operation. That's true. That was mostly the Brits. But the West fought a war to force opium into the Chinese population, and it's part of their knowledge and their history. So I think those two aspects, how 19th century imperial relations with China shaped their current belief of and risk profile, and what happened, and the real true complexity of Taiwan, its economic interdependence, its cultural ties, the fact that it's a deeply divided country, that Chiang Kai-shek and some of his regime were never actually seen as heroes with the domestic population that was basically invaded and then dominated for decades. That was always suppressed because it wasn't convenient for us to highlight it in the West. And now we're seeing the consequence of ignorance. It's kind of like one of those Vander crazy types. I forget which one, who I didn't know whether it was a Babylon Bee headline or a real headline, because that's the world we live in. But it's like, man, this electricity stuff is much more complex than we thought. It's like, yeah, I can imagine they actually are saying stuff like this in the Europe. It's like, oh, wow, this is a problem. You have Zoltan, the famous Credit Suisse guy, who's done a bunch of predictions. He was early saying that the Ukrainian conflict was going to completely shift the global economic landscape. Just sort of a Big Short kind of personality, just an economic analyst, but very foresighted and not as politically contaminated. He said, look, the bottom line was Russia gave a deal to Germany that was worth 100x. For $20 billion in gas a year, you're going to boost your economy by $2 trillion. That was the deal. Like, people thought it was a corrupt deal between Schroeder and Putin. It was a smart deal by Schroeder and Putin. Germany built up its industrial edge on cheap Russian energy and were able to salvage their domestic populace's green beliefs, the anti-nuke nuts, into shutting down their own nuclear energy. Not a great idea, but I get it. He was able to buy them off at the same time as he did a great deal for Germany's economy, and they're forfeiting it overnight. But I think that what's happening in Taiwan reflects the same disease of incompetence amongst Western elites who truly don't know the history, and they don't understand the Chinese perspective, strategic empathy from the Chinese perspective. And that's why, and that's of course how you bumble and stumble your way. Nancy Pelosi falling falling out of a car, or Joe Biden falling up steps into a global war.
This is all absolutely true. Now, can I just say, I be on the issue that you must never fall into the trap of saying that because you disagree with what your own government is doing, the other government on the other side is a perfect and wonderful government, and any criticism of it is somehow wrong and forbidden. I've been to China. I saw China. I went there in 2017. I spent some time there, and I was very impressed by many of the things I saw. And as I've always said, I've also found an intensely controlled society to a degree that in the West we have not approached, and which would be completely contrary to our own beliefs, our own values, if one uses that, I find frankly awful term. But anyway, let's put those words aside, beliefs and values. Let's talk about traditions, our political traditions, in which I personally do have a great personal investment. And I wouldn't want to live in the kind of way that Chinese society is structured. And I've no doubt at all, you spend any time there, you're not in a position to vote the Chinese government out. You can't, if you're just a Chinese, call Xi Jinping to account. These are things that are impossible. They may not be very possible here in the West either, but at least we have that theoretical possibility, which we must try and hold on to sometimes and make use of. In China, that sort of thing does not exist. So that's what I wanted to say. Of course, we must be skeptical, and we mustn't fall into the trap of saying that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And if somebody is the enemy of our government, the United States government, because our government does all sorts of bad and mendacious things and lies continuously, that automatically means that the government on the other side is good and right and virtuous. The world, humanity is far more complicated than that. That is not a realist position. That's just taking one form of bad idealism about our own government and exporting it to the other. And that's not seeing the world as it actually is. Now, Robert, you're absolutely right about the complexities of the history of Taiwan. But I will just say to people who say, we've got to stand by Taiwan. Taiwan is this little country. It's being bullied by this giant Chinese dragon, which is coming out to swallow it. First of all, the situation between China and Taiwan over the last 30, 40 years has been actually relatively stable. The Chinese pretend that Taiwan is part of their country. The Taiwanese pretend that Taiwan is part of China. The reality, as everybody knows, is otherwise, but it's a fiction which has worked up to now and kept things peaceful and has allowed both countries, both China and Taiwan, to prosper. What some people want to do, it seems to me, is that they want what they call clarity. They want to come along and they want to support Taiwan. And that will destroy that fiction, which, as I said, has worked, and which everybody knows is a fiction, but everybody pretends that it's the truth. It will destroy that. And what will it do for Taiwan? Now, what is supporting Ukraine done for Ukraine? Every day, I do programs for my channel, which you can watch, in which I do updates about the war in Ukraine. And I see every day pictures, films coming out of Ukraine. And I see some things. I'm not going to talk about what I see, but they are horrifying. They are appalling. Today, there's been an announcement that the region of Transcarpathia in Western Ukraine is going to have a day of mourning because one of the soldiers from a Ukrainian brigade that was conscripted. They were recruited in this region, in Transcarpathia. They were thrown into battle as part of this great counteroffensive that we've been pushing Ukraine for weeks and months to launch. And they were obliterated. They were killed in the most gruesome ways. And that's what you do. That's what you do when you come along and you disrupt and disturb what could be perhaps somewhat unclear, ambiguous relationships between countries. The situation between Russia and Ukraine was stable before we supported the Maidan movement in 2014 and engineered the overthrow of the democratically elected president of that country. The situation between China and Taiwan was stable. It's we who come in and we destabilize these things. Now, we might do it for idealistic reasons, but whether we do it for idealistic reasons or for cynical ones, it is the people in these countries, in Taiwan, in Ukraine, who ultimately pay the greatest price. We are not helping them. We are making their lives impossible. And in the case of Ukraine, well, to say it straightforwardly, what we have done has resulted in many of them being killed.
No doubt. And, one of the propagandists and provocateurs towards Taiwan was Pompeo, who Trump foolishly made both CIA director and Secretary of State, now understands the degree to which Pompeo was undermining him all the way through his entire administration, because Pompeo can't keep his mouth shut now that he's left, nor could he ever. But a fascinating federal lawsuit here in the United States. The lawyers and journalists who met Julian Assange and anyone else who met Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy in London would have the same grounds to bring this suit, have filed suit against Mike Pompeo individually, as well as aspects of the CIA and the U.S. government, plus a private security agency. And how it works is like a test. It's amazing how Assange, kind of like Trump, sometimes directly, sometimes almost by accident, exposes how the deep state operates. And in this particular instance, what the suit details is that and for whatever reason, I can't believe it, the Ecuadorian embassy hired a private company to manage the security at the embassy in London, which is invitation to trouble. As the father of the man dating Princess Diana can understand, he found out his own security at places like the Hotel Ritz in Paris were actually working for and with MI6 and other intelligence agencies. It's very common. Doorman and avoid hotels, folks. Stay at Airbnbs. Just word of the wise. But the never in writing, always in cash. Two good principles. Too many people forget those. But the dynamic of what was taking place there is replicated in this suit, in that the Ecuadorian embassy hired a private security company. The private security company goes to a conference here in Las Vegas, and they go to a certain hotel, and it's the Venetian Hotel. The Venetian Hotel was owned by Sheldon Adelson. Adelson, very big Republican donor. He's also just obsessed over Israel, and has tight ties to the Mossad. So Adelson's people find out. Well, you wonder how they got to that place. My guess is they got an invite. This was all an operation from day one. The security guy goes to this conference, having fun in Vegas. Everything, happens in Vegas, doesn't always stay in Vegas. He gets introduced to people who say, hey, if you do some work for us involving Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy, we'll give you lifetime supply of contracts from the deep state operatives in the West. And so this dude's thrilled, goes back and tells everybody, I've hit the jackpot. And what happened was the security company under the Ecuadorian embassy was, when the people came in, they said, oh, we need to, have your phone, your laptop, that has to be separate. That can't go in there with you, and so forth. What they didn't tell them is that they were scanning them and downloading all the data and all the information. I told some people who went and visited Assange, don't take your phone, don't take your computer, take nothing. Walk in there with just your clothes on and whisper and have some background sound on. Now, I think Assange did some of the latter. But how some of these people You're fighting the deep state, and you don't know how to, sometimes God bless, but that's another story for another day. So they were stealing all these journalists and all the lawyers' private communications, all of them, all their contact points, all their emails, all their computers, all their files, which in my view, this is going to come back up if Assange is ultimately extradited to the United States, which appears likely. Though he's brought up a pretty robust set of challenges before the UK high courts. We'll see if it gets any further than the last one did. My understanding is it's procedurally tough to get those, but you would know that better than I would, Alexander. Assuming he does get extradited, if it was an honest court, which I don't know if he'll get because of the Eastern District of Virginia in national security cases being notoriously rogue. Not all of them, though. There's one in a Flynn-related case who's been pushing back against a lot of indictments, including dismissals of a case saying this is a misapplication of the law. That's more of an intellectually independent guy. But is that Julian Assange has a complete grounds for complete dismissal. No doubt about it. Because when you have breached the attorney-client privilege, when you know someone's entire legal defense in advance, there's no remedy for that other than dismissal. That there's no way to purge that from people's memories. There's no way to prove that never was used. I'm sure that's what they'll say. But the proper constitutional remedy is if you commit that kind of constitutional violation, you cannot go forward with a criminal prosecution. And that, and maybe the folks I don't know if they're incorporating it or if they can incorporate it in Assange's extradition challenge, but it's additional grounds because by the way, 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, once again, just last week, refused to enforce the extradition limitations put on by a defendant extradited from Brazil. And more people in extradition context need to raise that you cannot trust the promises of the United States government on extradition because they don't consider them binding and courts don't enforce them. But putting that aside, another issue is they should dismiss all the charges. They were spying on his attorney-client communications for years. There's no remedy for that beyond dismissal. That's the only palpable remedy, constitutional remedy that should be applicable because what this suit reveals is extraordinary Fourth Amendment violations occurring constitutional violations and Fifth and Sixth Amendment violations on a regular basis because Assange was known to be represented by U.S. counsel at the time concerning a pending criminal case. Once that happens, we can spy on people outside of the Fourth Amendment when they are not criminal defendants in certain circumstances. Depends on the circumstance. I mean, the Bill of Rights, in my view, limits the government, period, and where it acts to me makes no difference. But in certain contexts, at least. That's why I have problems with drone killings around the globe, extrajudicial executions, Guantanamo, the idea that, if we just move outside the territory of the United States, voila, Constitution goes vanish, is a major problem in my perspective. And it incentivizes a lot of dangerous behaviors and bad behaviors. But putting that aside, here it's undisputed. Julian Assange was represented by U.S. counsel throughout this time period because he anticipated a federal criminal indictment related to the Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, whatever you want to put, indictment at different times, different name. And they breached it. They invaded it and they intruded it. Now, I'm sure they're going to say they never shared it with the Justice Department. They never shared it with hogwash. There's no way when you allow the person to steal something and say, well, you can't prove I profited from the theft and thus you can't charge me with stealing is not an incentive system that works for justice. So the charges, if he does come to the U.S., he now has a very robust constitutional basis for complete dismissal of the charges that he didn't have before. He's always had the First Amendment challenge that still exists, that this is a violation of free speech. And going to that, what I told some of my friends on the right who were not Assange supporters, they were going to use the Assange example and template and exemplar, just like they did with Alex Jones, used Alex Jones as a template. And so for censorship and then for lawfare to justify censorship and lawfare against other dissidents, they're doing the same now with Julian Assange's case. It appears they're going to go after Project Veritas and James O'Keefe on the grounds of a diary. I've never heard of a federal criminal prosecution on the grounds of a diary in my life, but because obviously the diary was true. And how embarrassing is that the American media, Western media, is not covering the fact that the President of the United States had a daughter who put in her diary his abuse of her as a young girl, a completely inappropriate conduct. I mean, showering with her as a young teenage girl. I mean, and she herself describes of how I mean, this is a crime. That's what this is. And that's our president. Our president's not only a dementia candidate, he's a pedo profile. That's who he is. I mean, it's humiliating that this man is president of the United States to anybody who cares about America. But based on that diary, someone else sharing it with Project Veritas, they're trying to call it all a crime. That somehow, and what they're doing is the same thing they did with Assange. They're like, oh, we're not punishing the publishing of it, though if he'd never published, he never would have been prosecuted. That's what proves that's a lie. But we're punishing how he sourced it. The problem is everything is sourced at some level with money or incentives or encouragement. There isn't a journalist that says, oh, please don't give me those documents, whatever you do. And by the way, to show you the politicization of it, they're leaking information about Nikki Haley's fund donors that they illicitly got from hackers. Nobody's talking about prosecuting them. Trump's tax records and financial records were publicly leaked, including published by the New York Times. Nobody's talking about prosecuting them. So it's going to be used only against politically disfavored targets, of course. But they're going to use the Julian Assange predicate and precedent to go after James O'Keefe, simply because James O'Keefe thought about publishing the Biden diary, but really because he has been a needle in the establishment side going all the way back to 2008 when they tried to railroad him on charges down in Louisiana. And he's a guy who outed Big Pharma. He's a guy who's outed a wide range of scandals outside of the political context. But generally, they share one thing in common. They're anti-institutional. They expose the establishment at some level. And though he's seen as more of a Republican guy, his journalism goes beyond that and consistently has. He's exposed various Republicans along the way. But my friends on the right should have woken up. Julian Assange allowing that prosecution meant they could go after any of the rest of us. And now James O'Keefe is likely to experience that.
Gosh, well, can I just say, because I know a bit about the Assange case, that all of the points about the illegal surveillance, the violation of attorney-client privilege, all of that is indeed in the defense case in Britain, and it will be presented to the appeal court, the High Court, in the appeal that's coming. I have to say this, though. The High Court allowed the US government's appeal against the judge's decision that Assange should not be extradited to the United States because his health and life was at risk. And it did so on the basis that there were no reasons, there was absolutely no reason to doubt the assurances given by the United States government. And this is an issue that was brought up. These assurances were brought up and discussed, I think, in a couple of hours, without witnesses, without expert witnesses coming along and being invited to give evidence, without proper research being done. It was all done in just a few hours of hearing in the High Court. Now, Robert, you tell me that these assurances aren't worth the paper they're written on, and you're a US lawyer. You know about this. This is your work. The High Court allowed no opportunity for that to be discussed or thought through or debated or researched or investigated or tested at all. So that doesn't give one a great deal of encouragement that the High Court in London is going to pay much attention even to these fundamental issues of breach of private attorney-client privilege. I mean, what they will do, what they will say, however wrong and crackers it is exactly what you said, that, you know, they'll say it was the CIA, the Justice Department has nothing to do with it. The so-called Chinese walls that keep this kind of information passing. The US government, the Justice Department, will give them assurances that they don't need to be worried about this because, of course, none of that information will ever be used in the court. And given that the British High Court has already said, well, you know, if the assurances come from the US government, well, they must be, they're absolute gold. You can have money in the bank. You can't possibly doubt the good faith in which they're given. I'm afraid I have little confidence, very little confidence, that this latest High Court appeal is going to succeed. It is going to be useful for one purpose only, in that it's going to rehearse and bring out many of the points which I expect are going to be made when, as I'm afraid is, I fully expect to see, when Julian Assange is eventually extradited to the United States. And I'm going to say that hopefully in the United States, where this law, these constitutional issues are much better understood than they are in Britain. And of course, we don't have a written constitution in Britain, even though we invented the concept of attorney-client privilege. There's a famous case from the 16th century that says an attorney cannot give evidence against his own client because that would violate attorney-client privilege. That's the first, that's the oldest precedent I know of which actually says that and actually uses the word, the concept of privilege. And actually uses, I believe, the very word privilege. Despite that, I don't think that the High Court is going to really understand this, or at least if they do understand it, they'll pretend they don't, and they'll accept whatever assurances the United States gives to them. After all, that they were prepared to accept assurances on the conditions he would have when he was extradited to the United States. Why won't they accept assurances on other things? So I'm very, very pessimistic about this, but at least all of these arguments will be canvassed. And of course, that might help things along when the case comes to America, comes before a US court, is argued out by US attorneys, and is debated properly before American juries, who hopefully have a better understanding of this kind of thing than our British courts do. Now, as for the O'Keefe business, I know a certain amount about it. I don't know the full story. Well, everything that I have heard about it utterly horrifies me. It is another example of how constitutional protections in the United States are just being allowed to crumble, and that the Justice Department is taking the central role in all of this. And it is absolutely incredibly disturbing. And quite apart from anything else, thinking about doing something, thinking about publishing a diary, since when has that been a crime? I mean, all right. I mean, I personally don't think that if he'd published the diary, that would have been a crime either. I personally am sure that this would have been covered by the First Amendment of the Constitution. I mean, this is not my province, but that's how it looks to me. But thinking about doing something like that, well, I mean, that's a stop. That is absolutely bizarre. That is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever seen. I mean, that is absolute George Orwell country. I mean, it's thought crime. I mean, thinking about doing something has now become a crime, apparently. So, but there we are. That's the world we're in now.
No doubt. And it's analogous actually to the Trump case, because they're trying to broaden the construct of of unauthorized documents. If you have access to them, if you solicited them, if you received them or published them, any of the four, that you've now committed a federal crime by borrowing from statutes that were not meant to apply in this context and creating a new criminal law that says if you have our deep state secrets, you've likely committed a crime. If you've asked for them, you've likely committed a crime. If you want to publish them, you've committed a crime. If you incite someone getting them to you or disclosing them publicly, you've committed a crime. It's broadening this doctrine of unauthorized to consider it stolen, because what Ashley Biden did is she abandoned it under law. That's what she did. If I leave something behind, I don't get to claim it's mine if somebody else gets it. If I've abandoned it, it's not property I've been part of continuously, et cetera. Now, and the government sees stuff like this every single day. Hotels do this all the time. Lots of people do this all the time. So you can legally claim it and get it back, but she had not legally claimed it. So it was a illegally abandoned property. They could do what they want with it. Whether they got paid or not is inconsequential. But their real premise is you had something you weren't authorized to have because the legitimate owner didn't give it to you. And it's analogous to what they're saying with Trump. Trump couldn't declassify this because only the deep state could, if it fit our procedures and protocols. That kind of mindset, that kind of mentality, that they own it, they possess it. Kind of a different variation of Klaus Schwab's you're gonna own nothing and like it kind of routine. Eat the bugs. That mentality. But it's part of a broader, the question is whether the American judiciary can step into the gap. And whether it's the Julian Assange case, whether it's the Trump case, whether it's the January 6th cases, whether it's the James O'Keefe case, or the two other big cases I have concerning the vaccine. So we filed this past couple of weeks that there'll be big hearings in the fall and two big vaccine cases. One is by the big vaccine whistleblower, and this has global ramifications. Brooke Jackson. And in the United States, you're allowed to bring it. It actually stems from Britain. That if the king was defrauded, the king could bring a qui tam action against those who defrauded the king. Well, in America, the people are king. The people are sovereign. So an ordinary person can, on behalf of the United States, they call it a relator claim, can bring a claim in the name of the people of the United States against somebody who defrauded the people. In this context, there's a specific statute called the False Claims Act that governs it. So she brought her claim detailing how she witnessed the clinical 3 trial stage of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine in Texas. And she's been involved in this for many years, involved in this industry in many years, the clinical testing area. And it was so bad there's over 200 paragraphs of detailed facts, hundreds and thousands of pages and documents and photographs of information that's substantiated. That would take us weeks if we went through them all. To give you just a snapshot of it, if you walked into the clinical trial testing, this was the clinical 3 testing to make sure the vaccine is safe and effective and an actual vaccine. And you would find in the trash bags, you would see needles sticking out. In other words, one of the most basic safety mechanisms that exist in any form of medical industry is you have the right bags and dispose of needles correctly, given all the problems they can create. They weren't even doing that. You could walk in and see people's private medical information plastered on the wall. Under health HIPAA laws here in the United States, that's carefully guarded, carefully protected. The janitor could see them. It's that kind of lack of protection of private medical information. They were unblinding people, so people knew who was getting the placebo and who was getting the vaccine. Totally gutting a critical method for ascertaining the safety, efficacy, or clinically testing any drug. They weren't monitoring adverse events effectively at all. It was basically the whole clinical trial was a rushed joke. There was under the table payments going on. There was people getting benefits in a wide range of ways. I mean, just scandal after scandal after scandal. She sees this. She's shocked. She reports it legally. Pfizer is supposed to shut it down until all the problems are fixed. Notify everybody. Pfizer does neither. Instead, so she keeps going up the food chain of, hey, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, up the hierarchy, ultimately goes to the FDA itself. And as soon as Pfizer finds out, she's summarily fired and told to hit the door. So she brings the suit, explains how bad this is, how dangerous this is, how terrifying this is, and the rest. The Justice Department sits on it, never takes meaningful action, takes a hands-off approach, decides the Biden administration is not going to touch this case with a 10-foot pole. So we're obligated to take it ourselves and litigate it ourselves. Pfizer came in and moved to dismiss it all on the grounds by the way, this is something that's coming up around the world. Pfizer's claiming they contracted with the various governments out of their responsibility and accountability. That various politicians signed deals. You'll probably find, because Pfizer is the biggest criminal organization in terms of fines in the history of the United States government. One of the most, I call it one of the biggest criminal drug companies, one of the biggest criminal corporations in the world. Now, HSBC could give it a run for its money and being the money laundering bank of choice, but that's another story. But so what they did is they contracted with these governments in such a way as to avoid the possibility of them ever being sued, even in the United States, where they've stolen billions of dollars from the American Treasury, billions. And what they did is they cut a deal with the Defense Department and the Defense Department said, as long as the FDA does certain things, we'll write you the check. And in fact, they can't stop writing the check until the FDA says no, they have to keep writing the checks, even if the Defense Department doesn't like the deal anymore. That's how nuts this deal was. Pfizer leveraged the emergency to get crazy deals all around the globe. And their defense is it's okay that they committed fraud, because here what they did is it wasn't just fraud in the clinical trials. They forged information. They fraudulently and falsified a whole bunch of documents that were required to make sure the drug was safe, effective, and a vaccine in the first place. And so all of that information was false. And they say they're legally entitled to, because they have special contractual immunity, that they can't be sued in a court because they agreed to a secret arbitration proceeding with the government. All this stuff. And it shows, by the way, their culpability going in. They had every reason to know this was not going to be safe. This was not going to be effective. This was not going to be a vaccine. And they just wanted the money, and they were desperate for the money. And so they cut deals with the government to make it impossible for them to be sued for anything wrong with the drug, even lies they told to the government. Now we'll see if the federal judge has the courage to do what he said he was going to do. He said he was going to do is he was going to rule on the facts and the law and on the merits. Well, we win on the facts and the law and the merits, and we should get to discovery. My experience with federal courts in general is that federal courts don't always follow through on that promise when it comes to big institutional power with global ramifications. Because globally, this was $1 trillion scandal when you add it all up, from all drug companies, all connected entities, all activities around the globe. So, and it would rewrite public health forever. Then the other suit that we have, Bobby Kennedy and myself brought on behalf of Children's Health Defense against the Food and Drug Administration, concerns them trying to force these vaccines on little kids as young as 6-month-olds, people that are in foster care, that they're going to 10-year-olds and saying, you decide whether to take it. And then what does the 10-year-old see? Big Bird, because the FDA is saying it's safe. Elmo is on TV saying it's safe. Everybody in the local community is saying it's safe, saying it's effective, saying it's a vaccine, saying there's a COVID emergency that faces little kids. Problem is, all 5 of those things are flat out lies. It's not safe. It's not effective. It's not a vaccine under the traditional definition of vaccine. They changed that definition just so it could fit this. One of the things we're challenging in the suit. And there is no emergency of COVID facing little children in America. There just isn't. So, but the government's argument, FDA's arguments, they're above the law. They're saying as long as we use the magical words, emergency powers, nobody can sue us. And even if we're violating what Congress said were the limits on those emergency powers, still nobody can sue us. Even if we violate the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs the democratic participatory aspect of America's government, allowing notice and comment and citizen petitions and reviews and rights to answer and so forth. They're saying we don't got to abide by any of that. Screw that. Screw Congress. Screw the participatory process. Screw everybody. Screw the Constitution. If we say it's emergency, end of story. If we say that's Pandora's box and we say we're a right to open it, anything we say that comes out of it is Pandora's box, even if it isn't. And we're saying, no, they don't have that authority, number one. Number two, what they did wasn't really an emergency power because no emergency existed. And then number three, changing the definition of vaccines, lying to the American public, including little kids, about the safety, efficacy, and the nature of this drug not even being a vaccine is not an emergency power, either given to them by Constitution or Congress. In fact, it's contra what Congress said. It's contra what the Constitution said. So those two, now we have a very smart judge in that case. The big question is the courts have a long history in America of folding to the government, of capitulating to the government, of not standing up to government corruption and institutional corporate corruption. And that's what our federal judiciary is going to be tested. Can it step up to its constitutional role and protect the law and protect liberty and protect ordinary people or not? We'll find out in these cases, like we will in James O'Keefe, like we will in Julian Assange, like we will in Donald Trump.
Right. Well, I think these are going to be two of the most important and consequential cases that we're going to see for many, many, many years. Robert, if you win them, and I absolutely, sincerely hope you do, and you have my complete moral support in this. I mean, I think you fully entitled, justified to win. I hope you do win in every respect. Well, if you do, they're going to resound in every capital. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be bigger than the tobacco litigation, which in terms of its financial impact, I mean, I really do. I think what we're talking about is enormous. And given what one hears about the pharmaceutical companies, not just Pfizer, by the way. Well, no bad thing, by the way, because I mean, it's clear that they have gone hideously and horribly wrong. And the fact that they've gone hideously and horribly wrong isn't just proved by all the facts of misconduct that you've described. It's proved by their defense. Because what is that defense other than an argument that they've contracted out of the law? Now, how can you do that? How can you contract out of the law with a government as well? I'd say it can't be done. In fact, I not only say it can't be done, I'm absolutely sure it can't be done. The government can't just sign the law away. That's not within its power. Government is itself a creature of law. It is there to administer law. It's not there to override it in that kind of fashion, especially not for the benefit of one particular company in this sort of way. And when, of course, we're talking about the criminal law and fraud, then it becomes even more fundamental. Because how can you just say, you know, that you've come to an agreement, and this agreement means that, in fact, we are not going to be, you're immune from any of the criminal acts that you've committed. I mean, that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's ludicrous. I mean, I give it. I don't even know. It doesn't even come close to matching the absurdity of this. But just to take a couple of decades back in U.S. history, well, with Al Capone, and how an example of how you can't contract out of the law. Al Capone's attorney. I'm sure you know the case, Robert. I mean, he wrote a letter to the U.S. government saying, well, my client is prepared to admit that, he didn't pay all his taxes. Can we therefore come to some kind of a deal? And he didn't realize it, because he wasn't obviously a particularly good attorney, that what he was actually doing in that letter, which he thought was, privileged, because, it was a without prejudice letter, or what we call in Britain a without prejudice letter. What he didn't understand was that he was actually in effect admitting that his client had committed a criminal offense. And of course, the doctrine of privilege in that case does not apply to that kind of correspondence. Well, this is what you've described with Pfizer, is that on a humongously bigger scale. I mean, a deal which says, I can go out and commit fraud, and if I commit fraud, it's all right, because I've contracted with you, the government. I mean, let's do away with the Constitution. Let's do away with the law. I mean, it's just. I mean, I have to say, to me, this defense sounds absurd. It sounds completely absurd. But you're absolutely right. The fact that they are apparently relying on this defense, the fact that they actually sought this kind of, I don't know what even to describe it, this kind of contract with the government, what it proves, beyond everything else, is extreme bad faith. And I mean, they can't, given that bad faith, it seems to me, well, I mean, I don't think they have a leg to stand on. That's my quick, very brief summary and analysis of this case. I mean, if I got this wrong, perhaps you can explain it to me. Now, on the other case, the Bobby Kennedy children case, I think it's perhaps just as bad, though in a somewhat different way, in that this time the government basically says is, well, the Constitution doesn't apply. We've got these magic words, the, emergency powers that, we can just sort of conjure up and, hey presto, open sesame, whatever. That somehow means that the Constitution, the law, the rights of recourse, all of that, well, that's all sort of abolished. That doesn't exist anymore. That's all vanished away. I mean, that is perhaps even more disturbing, perhaps, than in the previous case, because in that case, it's the government itself, it seems to me, which is coming up with these crazy arguments. But that, of course, is exactly what you would expect to see from this particular Garland Justice Department and its various entities. So I hope you win in both cases. I hope you win in both cases because the cause is right, the cause is just, but also because the defenses, if they succeed, are frankly extremely disturbing in themselves. And one wouldn't want to see defenses like that succeed and be cited again as successful defenses in future cases, which, I mean, I have to say, I hope that I can't imagine that will happen. But, I take entirely on board what you say, that federal judges are sometimes very reluctant to go against what the government wants. Anyway, that's my quick take on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good bookmark to close out the conversation. Is that what all these cases have in common? What Trump, Julian Assange, Project Veritas, the FDA case, the Pfizer case, is it's all about secrets. In all of these cases, Pfizer kept things secret so they could get billions of dollars. The FDA kept things secret so they could push and lie about a drug that they knew didn't fit the qualities that they claimed it was to little kids. Julian Assange, his whole modus operandi has been to expose secrets because it's critical to foundation of government, and that to democratic, honest, real government, people-driven government is fewer secrets. And the same with Project Veritas and Donald Trump keeping the deep state secrets from the deep state in ways that continue to enrage them. And it shows the power of secrets to corrupt our society and our governance. And taking them on is a critical, essential role of anyone who cares about liberty or freedom or individual human rights going forward.
Absolutely. I second that completely. And as I said, Robert, good luck, good speed with this. As I said, you're fighting, the true just cause. And I hope and believe you will win. I'm sure this kind of thing, this can't be allowed to stand. It's just intolerable. It's just too obnoxious to, decency and basic law to be allowed to stand. So good luck. And as I said, we on the Duran, we wish you the full best in this.
Robert, since we're talking about secrets, what is the cigar that you're smoking? People want to know.
Oh, this is in honor of the great Latin revolutionary, Simon Bolivar. So it's a Bolivar cigar from that little island off the coast of Florida.
Very strong. They're very strong cigars, like Partagas and all of those.
Exactly. I like all the strong Cuban cigars. Best Cuban cigar I ever had was actually a pre-embargo Monte Cristo No. 2, 1958. Wow. Which you can get in place in San Francisco. But close second was when Davidoff used to make Cuban cigars. I didn't get them directly. Charlie Sheen gave it to me as a gift some years ago. I always knew Charlie's a nice guy, so I don't know about any of these other scandals or whatever. He was always nice by me. He was a fun guy.
Amazing. All right. That is a great ending point right there. All right. We will answer all the questions, by the way, that everyone sent. We'll answer them in a dedicated show. But I think, Robert, Alexander, you answered a lot of them during the live stream. Thank you to our moderators. I saw Alice in Blunderland, Zariel, Reckless Abandon, Alan Watson, GEC 810. And I think I got everybody that was helping to moderate. And let's see, where can people find you, Robert?
VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
All right. Thank you, Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com. Take care, everybody.